My name is Nora Bishop. I am 31 years old. For 8 summers in a row. My parents dropped me off at my aunt's house in June. They picked me up again in August. My sister got to go on family trips the whole time instead. 8 summers, 8 postcards, 8 versions of the same lesson written in my mother's handwriting. On the night of my high school graduation, my car sat loaded in the driveway before sunrise. By midnight, I was asleep under a different sky, in a state nobody in my family could have named. 5 years passed before anyone tracked me down. By then, I was standing behind the counter of my own cafe, 2,000 miles from the house where I grew up. My mother looked at the chalk menu, the framed newspaper article, the apron with my name stitched under the pocket. She looked at everything I had built without her. And the first sentence out of her mouth told me she had not driven 2 days across the country to say she was sorry. She had driven 2 days to collect something, standing behind her. One hand still resting on the doorframe the quiet, careful way he always managed doors. Was my father. He looked smaller than I remembered. His free hand hung at his side, shaking in a slow, steady rhythm like a phone buzzing on a table. I noticed it before I noticed anything else about him, and some cold, clinical part of me filed it away before I even had a word for what it meant. If you have ever been sent away so somebody else's life could stay easy, keep listening because I am not going to soften this for you. It is not a story about one villain in a doorway. It is a story about a whole house of people who decided, quietly, across almost 2 decades, that my comfort was the one thing the family could always afford to spend. Tell me in the comments which member of your own family taught you that lesson first. Let me take you back first, though, to the summer I turned 8 years old, and to the green suitcase that appeared, without warning, at the foot of my bed on the very last afternoon of 2nd grade. I did not know it yet, but that suitcase was going to teach me more about my family than anything anyone ever said to my face. It would take me 23 years, a 5-year disappearance, and one Thanksgiving dinner with the good china out, to finally understand exactly what that suitcase had been packed with all along. It was never just clothes. It was an assignment. And I spent 8 straight summers carrying it before I finally understood I was allowed to put it down. The suitcase arrived on my bed the very last afternoon of 2nd grade, sitting there like it had always belonged in my room. Hard plastic shell, forest green, 2 small wheels that clicked whenever they turned. My mother positioned it at the foot of the mattress the way you'd stage a present for a photograph. "Your very own big girl suitcase," she announced, wearing the particular smile she reserved for Sunday service. I was 8. In my head, suitcases only ever led to airplanes, and airplanes only ever led to Disney, because that had been exactly true for my sister 12 months earlier. For the whole drive that followed, I sat picturing castles and cartoon mice, quietly deciding which ride I'd beg for first. Instead, 2 days later, we drove 4 hours north into a town called Birch Harbor, Wisconsin, where my Aunt Roberta kept a white farmhouse that smelled permanently of flower and lake air. I watched cornfields give way to pine forest through the glass, still expecting somebody up front to mention an airport eventually. Nobody ever did. My father pulled into the gravel drive, and Roberta was already stepping off her porch before either car door had opened, wiping flour-dusted hands down the front of her apron. My parents lingered long enough to eat. Sandwiches out on the porch, sweet tea poured into jars that didn't match. My sister sat at the far end of that little table, eyes down, avoiding me the exact way you avoid someone whose situation makes you uneasy, even when none of it was your doing. My father hauled the suitcase up the porch steps afterward, one careful stare at a time, handling it the way he handled everything, like speed itself might snap it in half. My mother crouched to meet my eyes before they left. What came out of her mouth next would follow me for the rest of my childhood. Steady, girls, don't stir the pot. A quick kiss on my forehead, and she was back in the passenger seat. My sister already buckled in behind her, the whole car aimed toward a week in Destin, Florida. I stayed on that porch and behaved exactly the way I'd been instructed to behave. No fuss, no pot stirred. I was already alarmingly skilled at obedience, and nobody in that driveway seemed to find that alarming at all. Here's the part that took 2 decades to say out loud to anyone. The Destin trip had been booked back in March. The suitcase itself was purchased in April. Nobody thought to mention any of it to me until the second week of June, meaning the entire plan to ship me off had existed, fully formed, for 3 months before I was owed so much as a sentence about it. When people ask why I eventually left the way I did, quiet, methodical, every piece arranged well ahead of time, I tell them honestly, I inherited that technique from my own mother. She simply never imagined the suitcase would end up in my hands one day, too. Every summer that followed repeated the same pattern. Second week of June. Green suitcase loaded into the trunk. 4 hours of highway. Lunch on Roberta's porch. Then a car pulling away holding 3 people where there used to be 4. Weeks later, in July, a postcard would show up addressed to me in my mother's looping, upbeat cursive. Florida the first summer. A mountain lookout in Wyoming after that. A wooden pier somewhere along the Carolina shoreline the year after. 8 summers, 8 cards, and every last one signed off with the identical 2 words, in the identical handwriting, like nothing underneath that signature had ever needed to change. Miss you already? Roberta handed each card to me in silence, and later I'd catch her tucking it into a battered cookie tin kept on the pantry shelf, almost like she was preserving evidence for a trial that hadn't been scheduled yet. She never commented on it. She simply kept adding to that tin, year after year, as though some part of her already knew somebody would eventually come looking. I used to study those cards the way other kids studied the back of a cereal box, hunting endlessly for a prize that was never actually hidden inside. It took years before I noticed the actual gap. Not one card ever said, "We miss you." Not one ever promised, "Next summer you're coming too." There was never an apology folded into any of it. Just a caption stamped beneath a photograph I happened to be missing from. "Behold the family. Mid-vacation." I want to be fair about this, because fairness is the closest thing to justice I have ever fully believed in. My mother wasn't writing those postcards out of cruelty. I don't think cruelty ever entered her mind on purpose. Not once. She scribbled them the way anyone scribbles a postcard, in a hurry, wedged between 2 other errands, never once picturing a little girl 4 hours away who would spend years combing that same handwriting for a line that simply did not exist. Come September, my teacher assigned the essay every kid in Indiana got stuck writing, the one titled "My Summer Vacation." Mine described Wisconsin and earned a decent grade, and my mother would tack it to the refrigerator beside a photo of my sister riding a jet ski somewhere sunnier. 2 entirely different summers, pinned up under the exact same magnet. Somewhere around year 4. I stopped bothering to write those essays truthfully. Nobody ever caught the difference, which told me more about that house than the postcards ever managed to. The postcards, though, were not finished with me yet. Years down the line, one of them would end up mattering more than nearly anything else I owned. I owe my parents a measure of fairness here, a skill I have spent years deliberately practicing, no more generous than warranted, but no less either. So let me say plainly that none of this actually began with a suitcase. It started in a hospital ward. When my sister was 7 and I had just turned 3, doctors found leukemia in her blood. None of it lives in my own memory. I was simply too small to hold on to any of it directly. What I inherited instead was the structure that got built around that crisis, the kind of household shape that outlasts the emergency it was built for by decades. 3 years of chemo treatments, church potlucks organized specifically to raise money, a chest freezer permanently stocked with casseroles from neighbors who did not know what else to offer a family in that position. My mother spent so many nights folded into a hospital recliner beside my sister's bed that she could apparently drop into that exact position without fully waking up. My father picked up double shifts at the auto parts plant just to keep the insurance from lapsing, coming home past midnight smelling of stamped metal. Somewhere inside those 3 years, our entire household rearranged itself around a single fixed point. My sister became that point, the rest of us, myself very much included, turned into the framework that kept her propped up at the center. I understand it. Even now, a house on fire organizes itself around the fire. Nobody stops in the middle of a crisis to ask whether the smallest person in the room is getting what she needs. You just grab what is closest and you save what is burning. Aunt Roberta told me most of this years later, in pieces, over a rolling pin and a bowl of flour, because my parents almost never spoke about those 3 years directly. She said my mother lost 11 pounds she never got back. She said my father stopped attending his own brother's wedding because he could not leave the hospital wing for a weekend. She said I spent most of that time at Roberta's own house, a toddler being minded by a woman who was, at that point, still mostly a stranger to me, because there was nobody left at home with room to mind a 3-year-old. I do not resent any of that. A family in survival mode has to make triage decisions, and mine made the only ones it could. My sister's remission came when she was 10 years old. There was a bell at the hospital, the kind cancer patients ring when the treatment finally ends. And there is a photograph of that day still hanging in my parents' front hallway, faded now at the edges. She is 10. I am 6. Bald patches on her scalp, just starting to fill back in with new hair. Everyone in that photograph is crying the good kind of tears, and I do not doubt for 1 second that they were real. By every reasonable measure, that should have closed the chapter. Instead, it hardened into the operating charter for the rest of my childhood. My parents came out of those 3 years with something like a mission statement, even if they never said it in so many words. Making memories with my sister, because they had come so close to running out of chances to make any at all, and they came out of it with a belief about me that hardened over time, like wet concrete left out in the sun. Nora is the easy one. Nora is healthy. Nora does not need anything. Here is the detail I want you to sit with, because it is the one detail that changes everything else in this story. The summer trips without me did not start during the illness. Nobody left a sick child's little sister behind at a hospital bedside, whatever you might be imagining right now. They started 2 full years after my sister was already cured. The emergency had ended. The house was not on fire anymore. But the system the fire had built stayed standing long after the fire went out, the way a scaffold stays bolted to a building for years after construction is finished, because nobody ever circles back to ask if it is still needed. Nobody ever looked at the 8-year-old girl carrying her own suitcase up somebody else's porch steps and asked whether the emergency measures were still necessary. By then, triage was just how our family loved each other. It was not a decision anyone made twice. It was a habit nobody ever tested. I have thought about this a great deal since I became an adult who runs her own small business, because running a business teaches you to notice exactly this kind of thing. You set up a temporary policy during an emergency, a discount, a shortcut, a rule made to survive 1 bad month. And if you never sit back down and ask whether the emergency is over, the temporary policy becomes the permanent shape of the whole operation. Nobody ever sat down in my family and asked that question. Not once. In 8 years. My sister, to her credit, back then, was just a child living inside the only version of the family she had ever been shown. She did not choose the diagnosis. She did not choose the bell, or the photograph, or the mission statement that got written in the years after. Whatever she became later, and we will get to that. I want to be honest that at 10 years old, she was not yet the person responsible for any of this. That responsibility belonged entirely to the 2 adults who kept renewing a policy that had already expired. The summer I was 11, I built an actual case for myself. That year's destination was Zion National Park, and the wanting was so intense it physically ached somewhere behind my jaw. Being 11 and already something of a strategist, I did not approach it casually. My bag was packed a full week ahead of time. I drafted a list titled "Reasons I Should Come," marker on notebook paper, folded into quarters, and carried around in my pocket like a permit. Reason number 1 was that I had never in my life seen anything a full mile deep, for 3 nights running. I rehearsed the delivery in the bathroom mirror. I can still describe exactly what I had on that afternoon, which is an odd thing to remember from age 11, except certain moments simply burn themselves in at full clarity while the rest of the year fades to nothing. A yellow shirt printed with a cartoon sun. Mismatched socks, because I'd dressed too fast, too anxious to notice. The night before, I stood at that same mirror shaping the words over and over until the whole thing stopped sounding like pleading and started sounding, to my 11-year-old ear anyway, like a fair proposal between 2 equal parties. Then came the actual kitchen, list gripped in one fist, my mother drying a mixing bowl at the sink while my father hovered in the doorway twirling his truck keys, already halfway somewhere else in his head. I made it through the entire pitch without my voice betraying me, which at the time felt like the genuinely hard part. My mother lowered the towel. She crouched down until we were face to face, her usual posture whenever a conversation turned serious, and her voice softened into that particular flannel register. "This trip is for your sister, sweetheart. You understand. When my chin betrayed me instead." She smoothed my hair back and closed the subject with the family's favorite line, "Steady girls don't stir the pot." My father contributed nothing at all. Silence was simply his instrument, the whole orchestra of it. And it took me years to understand that his quiet was itself a choice being made, not the absence of one. I retreated to my room and kept the pot entirely unstirred. Downstairs, the dishwasher clicked on. The television murmured. The whole house settled into its ordinary evening sounds, without me in the middle of any of it. But here's the part I have never once shaken loose. Even now, even after everything since, around 9 that night, a soft rolling noise reached me through the floor. Small wheels crossing hardwood in the hall below. I crept to the top of the staircase and looked down. There sat my suitcase, zipped shut, packed, already stationed by the front door like a cab idling for a fare that had not even been called yet. I lowered myself onto the top step in my pajamas and just stared at it a while, counting all 4 wheels as if that number could somehow explain anything about my own situation. I had never laid a finger on that suitcase. I had never spoken a single word about surrendering. Somebody downstairs had answered a speech I hadn't even finished composing yet, deciding my fate before I'd worked up the nerve to ask for a different one. Packing it early wasn't really meanness. It was simply efficiency. It told me the verdict had been locked in from the start. untouched by a single hour of the 3 months they'd apparently spent arranging it. I climbed back into bed without a word to anyone. Nobody brought up the suitcase the next morning, myself included. That particular silence, more than the suitcase itself, ended up teaching me the real lesson of that house. Nobody ever told you no outright. You simply found, eventually, that the door had already swung shut on you quietly, sometime while you were still gathering the courage to knock. I never once asked to join a family trip again after that summer. There was no need to relearn the same lesson 8 more times over. One quiet night with a packed bag and a closed door had already delivered the full verdict for every summer still waiting ahead of me. If this were a tidier kind of story, I'd tell you the summers themselves were the entire punishment, and stop there. They were not. That's the complicated mercy sitting right at the center of my childhood, and I refuse to skip past it just because it muddies the villain of this particular tale. I never mentioned the stairs, or the suitcase, or any single detail of that night to my sister, not that year, not for a very long time afterward. Not until we were both grown women with entirely separate lives built on opposite sides of the country. Partly pride, partly the plain fact that the two of us were almost never alone long enough for that kind of conversation to happen naturally. She was usually already buckled into the car, waiting for the trip to start. By the time I finished whatever brief goodbye the staying behind parent allowed, looking back now, with far more time to examine it than I ever wanted, I suspect that distance between us was its own quiet arrangement, intentional or not, because on the far end of that 4-hour drive waited a woman who was about to become the only adult in my entire life who ever asked me, plainly, with no audience watching, what I actually wanted for myself. A simpler version of this story would treat the summers themselves as the whole sentence handed down to me. That is not accurate, and the inaccuracy is the complicated mercy sitting right at the center of my childhood. Roberta's lake house was the single place on the entire map where I stopped being the easy one, the quiet one, the girl requiring nothing from anybody. There. I simply got to be Nora. She was my mother's older sister, 6 years apart, widowed young and never remarried, no children of her own to raise, and by then she had already spent 28 years behind the counter of a small Birch Harbor bakery before her joints finally forced her into slowing down. From my very first stay with her, she put me straight to work. And I mean genuine labor, not the busy work adults invent to occupy a child, real dough under my hands, an actual kitchen scale, real customer orders taped to the counter in her own slanted script. The summer I was 9, she taught me a proper crust, standing directly behind me, both her hands wrapped over mine on the pin, teaching my fingers exactly how much pressure crossed the line into too much. Cold hands, warm heart, she liked to say. Built for pastry, whenever I wrecked a batch, which happened often enough, she'd make me talk through the failure out loud like a physician running through a diagnosis. Too much water. Butter gone soft. Overworked dough that had lost its structure. Then we started over, and we kept starting over until I got it right. And not once did she make starting over feel like failure. At her table, I got asked real questions, and my answers actually changed what happened next. What should we bake this weekend? What should we plant in the garden bed by the porch? What should we watch on the television after dinner? Small things, all of them. But nobody had ever handed me that kind of ordinary decision-making power at home, where every question that mattered had already been answered before I arrived in the room. I once overheard her describe me to a neighbor who'd stopped in for a loaf as my summer girl, and I spent the remainder of that entire day carrying myself like royalty had just tapped me on both shoulders. It is strange, the things that stay with you at that age. Not the vacations I was missing. A stranger hearing 3 words about who I was to somebody. One night when I was 11, not long after the suitcase incident, she looked at me across a fresh peach pie cooling on the counter for a long moment, longer than usual, and she said, "Around here, quiet isn't your assignment. You're only ever Nora." Then she seemed to be gathering herself to say something else, something bigger, and I watched her visibly decide against it. She got up instead and refilled my glass of milk, and the moment closed over like water. All through those summers, there were sentences like that one. She would start walking toward something true and then turn back. The way a person walks out toward the end of a dock and then decides, at the last possible second, that the water still looks too cold to go in. I noticed the pattern even as a child, even without having the words for what I was noticing. Something was being protected from me. Or perhaps I was being protected from it. And either way, nobody was ready yet to hand it over. I did not know back then that the sentence she kept turning away from had a name, and a date, and a phone call attached to it. I would not learn any of that for another year, but I remember thinking, even at 11, lying awake in the guest room above the bakery with the lake sounding through the screen window, that whatever Aunt Roberta was not telling me mattered more than almost anything anyone had actually said to my face all summer. There was a rhythm to those months that I only recognize now. Looking back at it with a baker's eye instead of a child's, mornings started early, before the heat came up off the lake, flour dust hanging in the light from the kitchen window, like something you could almost taste before you tasted it. Afternoons were for the garden, or for riding my bicycle down to the public dock to watch the tourist boats come in, or for sitting on the porch with a cookbook Roberta had inherited from her own mother, its pages soft and translucent at the corners from 40 years of buttered fingers turning them. Evenings were the best part. She never had a television running for background noise the way my parents' house always did. She talked to me instead, actual conversation, about the bakery, about customers, about her late husband, about nothing important at all. And somehow all of it felt more important than anything discussed at my own dinner table back in Indiana. I did not have language for it then. But what she was giving me, without ever once naming it, was attention, undivided, uncomplicated, entirely mine. I used to dread the last week of August the way other kids dreaded the first day back at school. Not because school was frightening, because the last week of August meant the green suitcase would come back out from under the guest room bed, and I would have to fold myself back into the shape my real house expected of me, the shape that did not ask questions and did not stir any pots. The summer I turned 12, I finally learned what those unfinished sentences had been hiding. It was late, past 11 at night, and I'd gone downstairs for water. The kitchen light was still burning. Aunt Roberta sat at the table with the receiver pressed hard to her ear, and I froze in the dark hallway because her voice carried a tone I had genuinely never caught from her before, sharp-edged, almost begging, which did not match the calm woman who diagnosed ruined pie dough like a physician reading test results. Just let her live with me through the school year. Diane, that fragment reached me clearly before I registered. I wasn't supposed to be hearing any of it. Diane is my mother's given name. A long silence followed, long enough that I could make out the lake knocking against the dock through the screen door, that same patient, indifferent lapping it always made. Roberta again, and this time the sharpness had gone cold rather than hot. That's not how it would look. A pause. Is that your whole answer, Diane? Another stretch of quiet, even longer than before, then softer, almost to herself. "No, I'm not trying to take anything away from you. You can't take something that was already left waiting on a porch." Some sound must have escaped me, or maybe the old floorboard under my bare heel did the betraying for me, because Roberta spun around and found me standing there in my nightgown, clutching an empty glass like proof of some crime I hadn't actually committed. Her whole expression swapped costumes in an instant, back into the summer aunt version I recognized, and she assured me the school year up in Birch Harbor was nothing but slush and gray skies anyway, then steered me back up to bed with one warm, steady palm between my shoulder blades. Neither of us ever brought it up again, not that year, not for a long stretch afterward. I was 12. I only understood the temperature of what I'd overheard, never its actual substance. Something had been proposed. Something had been turned down flat, and the refusal carried a justification my own aunt clearly considered unforgivable, though I had no way yet of guessing what it was. I tucked the whole memory away in the same mental drawer children reserve for things that only make sense much later. For the remainder of that summer, I watched Roberta with slightly different eyes. I noticed her jaw tighten whenever my mother's name surfaced in casual talk with a customer, a small muscle shifting under her cheek I'd never once registered before. I noticed, too, that the occasional handwritten notes my mother mailed up separately from the vacation postcards stopped going into the cookie tin with the rest. Roberta started filing those somewhere else entirely, a drawer I never once saw her open in front of me. I went home that August the usual way, green suitcase riding in the trunk, 4 hours south, back into a house that welcomed me with its same warm, distracted routine. Nobody sitting at that kitchen table had any idea I had once stood in a dark hallway 2 states away and caught the exact outline of a decision made about my own future. One I was never consulted on, hashed out over a phone line between 2 women who each, in their own fashion, genuinely believed they loved me. Something shifts permanently in a girl the year she quits asking for anything. My parents read the shift as growing maturity. Teachers wrote self-sufficient on my report cards, and my mother repeated that word at dinner parties like a medal she had personally earned. Underneath the label, it was really just arithmetic. I had run the numbers on asking often enough to know the odds never paid out, so eventually I stopped placing the bet at all. Nobody teaches a child that lesson on purpose. You simply lose the same hand enough times that you learn to fold before the cards are even dealt. It would take another decade before I finally understood what Roberta had actually offered my mother during that phone call. Exactly what my mother had refused without a second's hesitation, and the precise handful of words she'd used to justify the refusal. 10 years is a considerable amount of time to carry around the sound of a conversation you were never meant to overhear, without knowing its meaning, only sensing that it mattered more than almost anything spoken to you directly your entire childhood. I want to be exact about one thing here, because exactness is the only fairness I actually trust. I am not building my aunt into a saint standing bravely against a household of villains. She kept a child secret buried for a full decade, and I've had to make peace with the fact that a gentler version of that year might have included telling me sooner. Even knowing the truth would have landed harder at 12 than it eventually did at 22. People shield children however they know how, and sometimes those methods do more harm than the shielding intends. I hold both truths at once these days. Gratitude for that porch, grief for the drawer that stayed locked for so long. What I did not understand yet, standing at the top of those stairs at 12 years old, was that the phone call I had just overheard was not really about a school year at all. It was about the exact width of the gap between 2 sisters who loved the same little girl in completely different ways, one willing to rearrange her entire life around me, the other unwilling to rearrange even a single summer. That gap would not fully reveal itself to me for another 2 decades, but some part of me, standing barefoot in that hallway, already understood I had just heard something the rest of my house was never going to say to my face. Around age 14, I cracked open a fresh spiral notebook and printed a single date across the first page. The June 4 years out when I would finally hold a diploma at 18. Below it, I built something that looked like an ordinary to-do list but functioned as a countdown, because even at 14 I understood that naming a plan too plainly could get it snatched away before it was ever finished. I ran calculations on every variable I could think of, monthly rent in cities I had only ever seen in library books, the full cost of a used car, insurance folded in, how much a careful, invisible person could actually bank in a single year. And invisibility had already become second nature to me by then, a skill nobody in my house ever bothered teaching me on purpose. That same year, at my grandfather's 80th birthday party, a gathering I mostly remember for the paper plates and the accordion someone's cousin insisted on playing badly, my grandfather, Earl, pulled my sister and me both aside for a photograph. He was already unsteady on his feet by then, leaning hard on a cane with a rubber tip that squeaked against the linoleum. After the photograph, while my sister ran off toward the dessert table, he held onto my wrist for 1 extra second and said something that made no sense to me at the time, something I did not think about again for years. "There's a piece of that house for each of you girls. Don't you forget it. Whichever one of you remembers this old man said so." I laughed politely, the way you laugh at something an elderly relative says that sounds like a joke wrapped around something serious. I did not ask what he meant. I do not think, if I am honest, that I even wondered about it for more than a few seconds. I was 14, and I had a notebook waiting for me at home with a countdown in it. And an old man's riddle about a house did not fit anywhere into the arithmetic I was already running. He died 2 years later, quietly, in his sleep. The kind of death people describe as a mercy at funerals. I went to the service. My sister cried in a way that seemed to genuinely surprise her, since the two of them had never been especially close. I remember standing at the back of the funeral home thinking mostly about my own countdown, about how many more summers stood between me and the version of my life where nobody got to pack a suitcase for me without asking first. It is strange, looking back now, how completely that sentence about the house slid out of my memory. It did not feel important. Nothing about it felt like a fact I would ever need again. The summer I was 15, the last summer I was sent to Birch Harbor under the old arrangement. I started keeping the notebook hidden inside a hollowed-out section of an old encyclopedia on my bookshelf, the kind nobody in a house with a working computer ever opens anymore. I wrote down every dollar of allowance I had never spent. I wrote down the price of a bus ticket west, then crossed it out when I decided a bus schedule left too much of my life in somebody else's hands. I wrote down words that were not numbers at all, just single words that meant something only to me. Out, far, mine. I did not tell Aunt Roberta any of this. Not yet. I loved her too much to make her carry a secret that heavy while I was still living under her roof every summer. Still small enough that a slip of the tongue could undo 4 years of careful planning in one afternoon. I told myself I would tell her everything once the plan was finished, once there was nothing left for anyone to stop. Looking back, I think some part of me already understood that the leaving itself, when it finally came, was going to be the loneliest thing I ever did. And that loneliness would have to start well before the actual night I drove away. My sister, meanwhile, was 19 years old that summer, and mostly absent from my daily life in the way an older sibling becomes absent once college, and a first apartment, and a boyfriend she would later marry all arrive at once. We were not close. We were not distant in any dramatic sense either. We were simply two people who had grown up under the same roof on two completely different sets of terms, and neither of us had yet been forced to look directly at the gap between those terms. She had no idea a notebook existed. She had no idea her little sister was hollowing out an encyclopedia to hide a countdown to adulthood. I do not think it would have occurred to her to wonder. I want to say clearly, because it matters for everything that comes later in this story, that at 15, 16, even 17, I did not think of my sister as an enemy. I thought of her the way you think about weather. Not something that had chosen to happen to you, just something that had happened, that you had learned to plan your life around. The notebook was never about getting even with her. It was about getting out from under a system. And at that age, I genuinely believed the system and my sister were two separate things entirely. The summer I was 16, I ran my first genuine operation. I requested to stay home alone that year and work instead of heading up to Birch Harbor, dressing the request carefully in the language of ambition rather than rebellion. Exactly the pitch a trustworthy teenager would make. My parents signed off inside a single minute. 0 follow-up questions. Too busy finishing their packing for 2 weeks at a Michigan lake house with my sister and her new boyfriend in tow. So independent, my mother told the neighbors, more than once, in a tone suggesting she'd personally cultivated the trait in me herself. How easily that yes came told me. One more time. Precisely how little of my daily existence either parent actually kept track of. I spent that entire summer waiting tables at a diner off the state highway. The sort of place with a sticky, laminated menu and a door chime that never once stopped ringing. Each night I rubber banded my tips and slid the bundle into an envelope taped behind a row of winter coats in my closet. Untouched territory until October at the earliest. On the outside, in pencil, a single word, out, 2 years later. On the day I graduated, that envelope had grown into an actual shoebox holding $7,150. And nobody in that house had ever once thought to ask what it was for. College, probably in their minds, and I let the assumption stand undisturbed. Colleges mail letters home, after all, letters that could be intercepted and discussed at that kitchen table long before I ever laid eyes on them. My real plan had already taken shape a different way entirely, the old-fashioned way, hunched over a paper atlas at a corner table inside the Millbrook Public Library that nobody else ever seemed to want. My criteria were simple and unsentimental, sharpened by 4 years of refining them in my head. Distant enough that nobody could show up unannounced on a lazy Sunday to check on me or drag me back. Affordable enough to survive on diner wages until something better turned up. And it needed bakeries. Since baking, thanks entirely to my aunt, was the one skill my own hands performed better than most adults twice my age. I paged through that atlas for weeks that spring, region by region, crossing off towns for reasons that made sense to nobody but me. Then, one April afternoon, I landed on a photo spread of northwestern Montana. And there it was, a town curled around water so blue it looked hand-painted. Mountains behind it still wearing snow even in the photograph's summer glow. Whitefish. I stared at that picture for a long stretch, thinking it resembled Roberta's lake, grown up, packed a bag of its own, and relocated somewhere nobody would think to search. That was the entire decision. No pros and cons list, no drawn-out weighing of options. Certain choices you simply recognize on contact rather than build argument by argument. I tracked down 3 cafes and 1 resort bakery in the town's business directory, copied every address onto a legal pad, and mailed inquiries that spring using my friend Jess's return address. Since her parents never checked their own mailbox before dinner, I told absolutely nobody, not even Roberta. Cutting her out of the loop was the single part of the whole plan that felt, even then, like swallowing broken glass. I understood my mother well enough, though, to know exactly what awaited Roberta the moment I vanished. Everyone who had ever loved me even slightly would end up seated at that kitchen table, questioned gently and endlessly in that same soft church voice, until they either produced an answer or proved beyond doubt they had none. Protecting my aunt meant only one thing: making sure she had nothing real left to lie about. An answer landed in Jess's mailbox that May. A cafe on the lake's north shore needed a dishwasher for the coming summer. The pay barely beat the diner. But the letter was genuine, real letterhead, signed by an actual person named Margot. I read it 4 separate times standing in Jess's driveway, then tucked it into my back pocket and biked home slower than usual, savoring the unfamiliar weight of finally having somewhere to go. I slept that night better than I had in years. The deep, bottomless sleep of someone who had finally quit falling and started, for once, actually landing. I did not mark the occasion. I told no one at all. The next morning I was back at the diner refilling condiment bottles, as though the entire architecture of my future had not just quietly rearranged itself overnight while the rest of my house slept on. Unaware, that turned out to be the final summer the green suitcase ever traveled near Birch Harbor. Everything left of the plan from then on lived strictly inside my own head, inside a hollowed encyclopedia, and inside a shoebox tucked behind winter coats, counting down to one particular Saturday in June that had, at last, come within reach, looking back on that 16-year-old version of myself, biking home in the dark with a job offer folded in her pocket. I am struck by how little celebration the moment actually contained. No fireworks, no diary entry underlined twice, just a girl pedaling a little slower than usual, trying to hold on to a feeling she did not yet trust enough to name out loud, even to herself, in case naming it made some adult in that house decide to take it away before she got the chance to use it. Graduation fell on the 2nd Saturday of June, held right on the football field, rows of folding chairs arranged across grass, still damp from a sprinkler system that had run a little too long that morning. I was awake before 5, and by past, my car, a used Honda I'd bought outright with diner cash, sat fully loaded in the driveway, $7,150 in tip money, banded tight and zipped inside a duffel bag beneath the spare tire, a spot I figured no casual thief would ever bother checking. The green suitcase rode in the trunk, packed this time by my own hands rather than anyone else's. Beside it sat something nobody watching me load that car would have guessed at: a second, smaller container. The cookie tin holding all 8 postcards, which I had quietly lifted off Aunt Roberta's pantry shelf the summer before. My final stay under that particular roof. The 2 days leading up to graduation. I said goodbye to almost nothing, because almost nothing inside that house had ever truly felt like mine to mourn losing. I gave my old bedroom one last glance, not from sentiment but from the same reflex that makes you double-check a stove before a long trip. I wanted certainty that I wasn't leaving behind anything I would actually miss. Nothing qualified. To this day, don't ask me why I bothered bringing the tin along at all. At 18, I called it evidence, the label you slap on something when you're not yet ready to admit it's actually an old wound you haven't finished pressing on. My parents did show up for the ceremony. I want to be exact about that detail, because exactness is the only kind of payback I have ever fully trusted. They arrived, they took their seats. Roughly 40 minutes in, somewhere around the middle of the alphabet. My mother leaned close and murmured that they needed to duck out early, since my sister's office was throwing her a small gathering that same evening over her first six-figure listing, and the interstate traffic only worsened the longer they waited. She squeezed my wrist on her way out of the row. "So proud of you," she said, already rising. When my section finally stood and the announcer read out, "Nora Ann Bishop," I crossed that stage, shook a stranger's hand, and scanned the crowd to find 2 empty folding chairs, unopened programs still resting on the seats. Here's the strange part, the one I still turn over even now. It didn't wound me the way I'd braced for. It landed instead like a receipt, the universe tallying up. One last time. Exactly what I had always been worth to them. So I could walk off that field with the arithmetic finally settled and confirmed. I had spent my entire childhood quietly wondering whether leaving would make me the villain of this family. Staring at 2 empty chairs while a stranger read my name aloud, the wondering simply stopped. Some questions resolve themselves the instant you no longer need the answer. That evening, I sat through dinner with my parents, as though nothing unusual was underway. I mentioned I was tired. I went up at my usual hour. And at 4 the next morning, I left for good. I set a note on the kitchen table, anchored under the sugar bowl so nobody would mistake it for garbage on their way to brew coffee. I had rewritten that note perhaps 30 separate times across the previous winter, each version shorter than the last, because every honest thing I actually wanted to say kept compressing itself down into fewer words the longer I sat staring at it. The final draft read simply, "I'm safe. I'm grown. Please don't come looking." I signed it with one letter. N. The shortened version Roberta always called out from the porch at dinner time. I've never fully settled whether that signature was meant as a clue for anyone searching, or just a private goodbye addressed to myself. Then I eased the car out of the driveway with the headlights off, not switching them on until I reached the corner, where the darkness finally felt safe enough to navigate by. Oddly, I didn't cry pulling away. I had expected the leaving to feel monumental, the kind of scene a person replays for decades as the hinge of an entire life. Instead, it felt almost clerical, like closing out a cash drawer at the end of a long shift, counting twice, locking up, flipping off the lights bank by bank. Somewhere behind me, in a house that wouldn't stir for another 2 hours, was a family that had never once needed to ask where I kept my savings, because it had never once occurred to anyone that I might have any. I drove west along the interstate as the sky began graying at its edges, never once checking the mirror. Not out of some point I needed to prove to myself, but because there was truly nothing back there worth another look. Somewhere past the state line, radio off, windows cracked just enough to let the cold morning air in. I said my own name out loud into the empty car, quietly, testing whether the words still fit the way it used to. Nora Bishop. For the first time in longer than I could remember, it sounded like it belonged entirely to me, with nobody else's name folded in beside it, and nobody left to decide what that name was supposed to mean. 3 days on the road, close to 2,000 miles covered. Twice I slept, curled in the Honda's back seat inside Walmart parking lots, doors locked, seat reclined as far back as the mechanism allowed. The duffel of cash tucked beneath the spare tire like a second, quieter pulse running underneath the car's real one, somewhere in eastern Montana, still hours out from wherever I was headed. I pulled into a gas station, pried my old phone apart with a butter knife from the glove box, and slotted in a prepaid phone card I'd bought weeks earlier back in Indiana. Paid for in cash. My old digits. The ones my mother could recite from memory without ever needing to check her phone, ended up buried in a trash bin outside some gas station whose name never once stuck with me. By the third evening, cresting a rise on the highway, the whole town of Whitefish spread out below me at once. Pine forest sloping straight down into water so blue it read as artificial rather than real. Mountains behind it still dusted white despite the season. I had to grip that steering wheel with both hands because they wanted badly to shake, and I simply had no attention left over to spend managing them. 18 years old. Everything I owned crammed into the back of a hatchback. Not one person on the planet knew my location. And I mean that literally. Not a single soul alive. You'd assume that kind of isolation would feel like plummeting. Instead, it felt like the first complete breath I'd drawn since age 8, standing frozen on a porch in Wisconsin, absorbing the lesson about never causing a fuss. 11 days in, a police officer rapped on the door of the weekly rate motel room I'd been renting while apartment hunting. I opened it already certain who had sent him. My mother had gone to the police the very day after graduation to report me missing, and investigators traced that report through my first debit card purchase, a tank of gas I'd carelessly paid for electronically before learning to stick to cash, straight to a welfare check on my doorstep. He looked younger than expected, and completely uninterested in the whole affair, which happened to be exactly what that afternoon needed most. I handed over my license alongside the brand new lease I'd signed only days before. He looked over both, studied my face briefly, then asked the single question the law genuinely concerns itself with in cases like mine. "Ma'am, are you staying somewhere by choice?" I answered yes. He had me sign paperwork acknowledging myself as a voluntary adult who had gone missing, then ran through the remaining details in the flat, well-worn tone of someone reciting a script memorized long ago. My family would learn only that I'd been found safe, not where. That protection was mine by law, and no amount of soft-voiced charm was going to talk it away. Right before I swapped numbers permanently, one final voicemail slipped through. I played it exactly once, standing in that motel room. My mother's voice, tight and performative at once. "Nora, honestly, all this drama isn't like you. We raised you to handle things better. Steady girls don't." I hit delete mid-word, and the room dropped into a silence that felt oddly like a genuine accomplishment. That remains, to this day, the single occasion in my life when I got to finish one of her sentences myself, simply by cutting her off before she could. That same week, unpacking the trunk into the motel dresser, I dug the cookie tin out from beneath the winter coats I'd piled over it for the drive. All 8 postcards, still stacked in order, exactly how Roberta had always kept them. Near the bottom, the 3rd card, the one from the Carolina boardwalk, caught the bedside lamp at an angle and revealed something I'd never once noticed across all those years it sat quietly on her pantry shelf. A line in my mother's round, unmistakable handwriting had been started beneath the usual 2 words, then scored through hard enough that the pen had actually broken the paper at one edge. "The summer fund covers," it read, before the ink simply cut off mid-thought, as though something or someone had interrupted her. I sat on the edge of that motel bed for a long while, turning the card under the lamp from different angles, checking whether the scratched-out words concealed anything further. They did not. Whatever she'd nearly written, she'd caught herself in time and settled instead for the finished card. 2 cheerful words, and nothing else. Apparently the only version I was ever meant to receive. None of it made sense to me yet. No fund had ever come up, not once. across 8 entire summers of postcards, porches, and packed suitcases. I returned the card to the tin, set the tin on the closet shelf above my few hanging clothes, and let that particular sentence sit unexamined for a very long time afterward. Some questions, as it turns out, are perfectly content to wait. I did not know it yet, lying awake that first week in a rented room 2,000 miles from everything familiar. But I had just carried the single most important piece of evidence in this entire story across 3 states without recognizing it for what it was. It would take years, a lawyer's phone call, and one more scratched-out sentence finally spoken out loud before that particular postcard earned the weight it actually deserved. For now, it was simply one more thing I did not have the language to explain, tucked away with all the others. The years that followed moved faster than the ones before them, the way years tend to once you finally stop spending all your energy just surviving your own address. The cafe that hired me sat right on the north shore of the lake and was called the Huckleberry Table. 40 years old by then. Pine floorboards worn soft as soap under decades of boots. It belonged to a woman named Margot Ostrander, 65 at the time, who ran her kitchen with the calm, absolute authority of someone who had long ago stopped needing to raise her voice to be obeyed. I washed dishes 10 hours a day that first summer, and my hands cracked from the hot water in the cold Montana mornings, and I loved every minute of it in the specific way you love anything that finally, entirely, belongs to you and no one else. I found a small studio above a detached garage renting for $280 monthly, and that first October, when the baseboard heater quit entirely, I never once called my landlord about it. Notice that particular detail, because it took me years to notice it about myself. Instead, I watched repair tutorials at the public library, bought a $6 replacement fuse, and rewired the whole unit myself. Breaker flipped off, tongue pressed between my teeth in concentration. At the time I called this frugality. It was scripture. Somewhere across 8 summers, I had absorbed an unspoken family creed without a single lesson ever spoken aloud. Asking for things costs you something other people never have to pay. I would have frozen through an entire Montana winter before knocking on anybody's door for assistance. Hold on to that particular flaw. Everything else in this story eventually circles back to it. The week before Thanksgiving that same year, Margot's regular baker sprained her wrist badly enough to need a cast, and Margot found me standing at the sinks. "Anybody back there know how to bake?" she asked the kitchen at large, not really expecting an answer. My hand went up before my own shyness had a chance to vote against it. She stood over me, arms crossed, while I rolled out a test pie crust the exact way Aunt Roberta had taught me years earlier in a kitchen 4 hours from anywhere that mattered. Margot took one bite, studied me with an expression different from anything she'd shown me all season, and asked who had taught me. "My aunt," I said. "Well, your aunt raised herself a baker," Margot answered, and walked off without another word, leaving me standing over that crust feeling like I'd just been handed citizenship papers to a country I hadn't realized I already belonged to. By my 3rd year in Montana, I was effectively running Margot's kitchen on the mornings her hands gave her trouble, which turned out to be more mornings than she was ever willing to admit out loud. And through all of it, there was exactly one thread connecting me back to the life I had left behind. One I never once cut, because cutting it felt like a cruelty I was not willing to commit even against people who had been plenty cruel to me. Each June, that same second week, I picked out a single postcard showing the Whitefish Lake, the touristy kind, unnaturally blue water beneath an unnaturally blue sky. No return address printed anywhere on it, no signature added. In the space reserved for a message, I sketched a tiny crimped pie, the sort of absent-minded doodle you'd leave on a napkin, then mailed the whole thing off to a white farmhouse on a different lake entirely, over in Wisconsin. Roberta could never write back, having no address to send anything to. But the following summer, a customer at the cafe mentioned, entirely by accident, that her cousin had recently visited from Wisconsin. And I felt both halves of my life touch for exactly half a second before I walked into the walk-in cooler and stood there breathing until the feeling passed. Margot's health was not getting any easier during those years either. Her hands ached most mornings before the coffee even finished brewing. And more than once I caught her flexing her fingers under the counter between customers, quietly, the way you hide a limp from people who might worry too much about it. She never complained. She simply worked around it, the same way I had spent years working around things I never named out loud either. And I think that shared instinct, more than anything else, was what eventually made the two of us trust each other the way we did. By the time I turned 23, the cafe's future had become a genuine question, one I thought about constantly during slow afternoons at the register. Margot's suggestion that a regional lifestyle magazine feature the bakery for a piece on small mountain town institutions felt, at the time, like nothing more than good publicity for a business I was quietly hoping to buy from her someday. I hesitated for exactly one afternoon before saying yes, weighing the small, private cost of being seen against the very real benefit of the cafe being known by more than just the regulars who already loved it. I did not yet understand how far a small magazine article could travel once somebody somewhere decided to read it out loud to the wrong person at exactly the wrong kitchen table, in a house I had spent 5 years teaching myself not to think about before breakfast. 8 summers taught me how to disappear so completely that even a police officer standing at my own front door could not undo it once I had decided to stay gone. I got very good at it, better than I ever wanted to admit out loud. Good enough that I built an entire adult life on top of that skill, a lease, a trade, a reputation earned one pie crust at a time, out of the sheer stubborn discipline of never once being found by the people who had taught me how to vanish in the first place. What I did not understand yet, standing behind that counter agreeing to a magazine photograph, was that the same skill that had kept me safe for 5 years was about to work in exactly the opposite direction. Disappearing well enough for long enough eventually makes you interesting. And interesting, it turns out, travels a great deal farther than any small mountain town ever expects it to. Especially once somebody prints your real name in plain type underneath your own smiling face for anyone back home to eventually stumble across. The magazine ran the piece that early autumn, complete with a photograph of me stationed by the ovens in a clean apron, flour still ghosting one forearm. For roughly 2 weeks, I walked around feeling proud in the tentative way you test a new floorboard before trusting your full weight onto it. Then the magazine posted that same feature online, and unlike a small mountain town, a website carries no city limits at all. A woman I could barely place, some distant cousin of my mother's back in Indiana, left a comment beneath the photo 11 days after it went live. A single short line ending in a question mark. Isn't this Diane's girl? I never saw that comment myself until much later. Margot pulled it up on her phone one quiet afternoon, curious rather than alarmed, with no clue what those 4 words were about to trigger. I read it 3 separate times, the way you reread a diagnosis, half expecting the letters to rearrange themselves into something less final. They stayed exactly as written. 5 years of careful, intentional invisibility, undone by a stranger's passing curiosity in a comment thread neither of us had ever bothered to monitor. It happened on a slow Tuesday in late October, that dead stretch between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd. And I was packing up an order behind the counter when the bell over the door announced somebody's arrival. I called out that I'd be right there without glancing up. Then I glanced up anyway. My mother stood in the center of my cafe, 5 years and roughly 2,000 miles apart, and there she was, framed between table 6 and the pastry case, a good wool coat on her shoulders, more gray threaded through her hair than the version of her I'd been arguing with silently in my own head for half a decade straight. Behind her, easing the door shut with the same careful, silent motion he'd used on every door throughout my entire childhood, stood my father. He looked smaller than the memory I carried of him. His free hand hung loose at his side, trembling in a slow, unbroken rhythm, like a phone left buzzing on a counter nobody intended to answer. Some detached, clinical corner of my brain clocked that tremor and filed it away long before my thoughts had assembled a single word to describe it. Neither of them moved for a long stretch. Behind me, the espresso machine hissed on, entirely indifferent to what was unfolding. I watched my mother take in the whole room with one unhurried, practiced sweep, a skill she'd always possessed. The chalk-lettered pie menu in my own handwriting, the framed magazine spread hanging by the register, the apron double-knotted around my waist because it had originally been cut for someone built larger than I was, 5 years apart, and whatever sentence left her mouth first, I remember thinking would reveal everything I needed to know, exactly the way an opening line in our family always had. She wrapped up her survey of the room. Her eyes settled on me, on my entire steady, solvent, untroubled existence, and her lips pressed together in that specific way that always preceded her church smile taking over. Then she spoke. "Well, this is quite the operation you built for yourself out here." That single sentence told me, instantly, and without any remaining doubt, that they hadn't driven 2 days across half the country to deliver an apology. They'd driven 2 days to collect a debt. I poured them coffee regardless. I want to explain precisely why. Because it wasn't weakness, and it wasn't forgiveness showing up early. A woman standing on ground she actually owns can afford to pour coffee across it without surrendering a single inch of that ground in return. They settled onto stools at the counter like any other customers. My father lowering himself carefully. One palm braced flat against the countertop the entire descent, the tremor stretching the whole motion out twice as long as it should have taken. 5 years is an odd length of time to sit across a counter from your own parents, long enough that a passing stranger might have mistaken the scene for exactly what it resembled from outside, a small-town baker pouring coffee for 2 out-of-town visitors. Not long enough, evidently, for my mother to have rehearsed even one new line since the last time she'd looked at me directly. She still surveyed a room the identical way. She still let silence stretch out however long it needed before stepping in to fill it. Absurdly, I found something almost comforting in that consistency. At least I wouldn't have to learn her all over again from nothing. My father left his coffee untouched at first. He wrapped both hands around the mug instead, steadying them. I assumed, staring down into it as though an answer might be floating just under the surface. I noticed, in the way you notice small details while actively avoiding a much larger one, that his wedding band had been resized. It sat looser on his finger than I remembered, twisted slightly off-center, as though even his hands had shrunk somehow across the years I'd been away. I want to be honest about my own body in that moment, since the physical side of these encounters rarely gets discussed enough. My hands stayed perfectly steady the whole time I poured. My voice, once it finally arrived, never once wavered. But below the counter, out of sight. My knees had locked so hard against the cabinet that I'd discover a faint bruise there 2 days afterward, and briefly have no memory of its origin. For a full 20 minutes, my mother walked me through the official record of my own upbringing, and I sat there absorbing it the way you'd absorb a tour guide narrating a building you actually reside in. In her retelling, I'd spent 8 glorious summers with an aunt I worshipped. In her retelling, they'd handed me independence, the single greatest gift any parent could offer a daughter. And just look at the results. Look at this cafe. Look at this whole life. In her retelling, my disappearance amounted to a phase, a cruelty she'd endured gracefully on my behalf. And there was no point dredging any of it back up now that I'd apparently worked it out of my system. Here's the part that genuinely unsettled me about listening to her talk. She wasn't lying. You can always hear a lie coming. This wasn't that. My mother believed every last syllable of it, the way a person trusts a road they've driven for 40 straight years without ever once glancing at a map. Somewhere across those decades, she'd constructed an entirely private edition of our family history, where every single choice had sprung from love. And she inhabited that edition as comfortably as the rest of us had once inhabited the actual house, never once venturing down to check what sat gathering dust in the basement. My father contributed almost nothing to any of this, which counted as its own fluent language, one he'd been speaking to me his whole life. His finger drummed an uneven little pattern against the counter, a habit he seemed unaware he was even performing. Twice I caught him staring at the framed magazine spread on my wall, at my printed name beneath the photograph, wearing an expression I had no existing memory to match it against. Finally, I asked the one question 5 years had ground down to a sharp point. Why did it take this long to find me, if any of it actually mattered to you? My father, ever the quiet one, opened his mouth for what felt like the first genuine attempt since walking through my door. I did one breath into it. My mother's hand dropped onto his sleeve, light as a napkin settling onto a tablecloth, and the sentence simply died there, unfinished, the way so many of his sentences apparently had across the years. My mother folded both hands on my counter and got down to the actual reason for the visit. "Your father has Parkinson's," she said. "Diagnosed this past spring. Still early. The tremor, the stiffness. You've noticed his hand." She announced it the way a person reports the weather, flat and factual. Then let a full lap of silence pass through the room while I stood frozen holding a coffee pot, watching that single diagnosis quietly reshape the man sitting by the window. Someone I now realized I would lose in 2 separate stages rather than just the one. He glanced my way and offered a small, almost apologetic shrug, as though the disease itself were some uninvited guest he'd accidentally let through the front door. My mother kept talking, because the diagnosis, I realized a beat too late, had never actually been her point. It was only ever the setup. "Your sister simply can't take this on right now," she said. "The business, the house, everything already on her plate. You understand?" The phrase slid straight into grooves 8 childhood summers had already carved deep into me. Somebody else's needs first. And then, eventually, me. Apparently constructed without any needs worth mentioning of my own. She reached across the counter and closed her fingers around my wrist. That same rehearsed squeeze from graduation morning, 5 years gone now, delivered like a password neither of us had managed to forget. "You have always been the steady one." "Nora," she said, "it's time you came home." Home meaning Thanksgiving, as a starting point, A trial run she never once called by that name. "We'll make the announcement together," she added, clearly already drafting a guest list somewhere behind her eyes, the identical way she used to stage every holiday of my childhood like a network unveiling its biggest seasonal special. I stared down at her fingers wrapped around my wrist. French manicure. Her mother's old ring twisted slightly out of place, and the strangest sensation washed over me standing there. That hand carried an exact, measurable weight, and it weighed precisely what a baggage claim stub weighs. 5 years, nearly 2,000 miles of distance. A legal boundary drawn by a bored young officer in a motel parking lot, a lease bearing only my own name. An entire life assembled one cracked knuckle at a time, by my hands alone. And the very first complete sentence my mother had managed to build for me, after every bit of that, amounted to a work assignment. The steady one's old position had apparently reopened, and I was being formally summoned back to fill it. I withdrew my wrist gently, the way you'd ease a knife out of a child's grip before they understood what it could do. I said no, not a speech, not some trembling manifesto of independence, just that one word, delivered in precisely the tone she'd once used for "steady girls don't stir the pot," meaning calm, final, with zero intention of ever walking it back. Then, since the lunch rush sat 20 minutes out, I mentioned the kitchen needed me and suggested they sample the huckleberry pie before the long drive home. My mother's expression cycled through its full range in about 3 seconds. Hurt. Something close to parliamentary outrage. Before landing on wounded dignity. The look she wore better than any other. Through the front glass. I watched her steer my father toward their rental car on the sidewalk outside. One hand at his elbow the way you guide somebody who's stopped fully trusting their own footing. He glanced back at me once through the window. I didn't wave, neither did he. And somehow, strangely enough, that shared failure to wave turned out to be the single most honest thing the three of us managed to exchange during their whole 20 minutes inside my cafe. That night, my phone rang from an Indiana number I did not recognize, my sister. My mother had apparently given her the number she had demanded from me at the counter that same afternoon, a number I had surrendered simply to end the visit faster. I almost let it go to voicemail. I am glad, now, that I did not. I want to be fair to my sister here, the same way I have tried to be fair to everyone else in this story. Exactly fair and not 1 ounce more, no matter how the rest of this particular chapter eventually turns out for her. She did not open the call with the family script I expected. She opened with a question instead, quiet and strangely off balance, nothing like the composed real estate voice I remembered her using on the rare occasions we had spoken as adults. "Was it true," she asked, "that you loved going to Aunt Roberta's?" I told her the truth. I had never hated Roberta, not for one single day of my life. What I had hated was everything the visits meant, everything they were standing in for. And then I told her all of it, every piece. The suitcase packed in April, the porch, the 8 postcards with the same 2 empty words at the bottom of each one. The line went so quiet on her end that I actually checked my own screen to make sure the call had not dropped. Then my sister, 35 years old, a grown woman with a mortgage and a career built on reading the fine print of other people's houses, said, "Mom always told me you were happy up there." I spent my entire life taking her word for it. Her voice cracked on those final words in a way I had genuinely never once heard from her. Not even at our grandfather's funeral. She did not ask me to come home and help nurse anybody. She asked for exactly one thing. Don't disappear on me again. I did not know what to do with the sincerity in her voice. So I mostly just let her talk. She told me things I had never known. Small domestic details that filled in years I had missed entirely from the outside. that our mother still kept the thermostat exactly 2 degrees colder than anyone else in the house preferred it, that our father had started forgetting where he put his reading glasses months before anyone officially called it anything, and that everyone had quietly agreed not to mention it out loud, that she herself had a daughter now, 4 years old, a fact she delivered almost shyly, as if she was not sure whether I would want to know it at all. Coming from her. I told her I was glad for her, and I meant it, even while some smaller, more guarded part of me kept waiting for the conversation to turn. The way conversations with people from that house always eventually turned. It never did. Not that night. After we hung up, I sat for a long time at my own kitchen counter, looking at the cookie tin up on the shelf above the stove, the one holding 8 postcards and one scratched-out sentence I still did not understand. I want to tell you something about this moment that took me weeks to fully admit to myself. Part of me, in that exact hour, genuinely believed my sister. I believed she had been lied to just as completely as I had, in the opposite direction, told a story about my happiness the same way I had been denied the truth about hers. I believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative. And because, at that point in the story, I had absolutely no evidence yet that would have told me otherwise. That evidence was still years away, sitting quietly in a filing cabinet in a lawyer's office I did not yet know existed, waiting for its own turn to be found. Here is the part nobody warns you about when you finally cut contact with people who raised you. Walking away is a single decision, made once, on one specific night with the headlights off. Staying gone, it turns out, is a decision you have to make again, fresh, every single morning after that, for as long as you intend to keep it. If you have ever had to choose between your own peace and your family's version of who you are supposed to be, please hear this. Whoever and wherever you are tonight, none of that struggle has gone unnoticed. Tell me in the comments if you have ever made that same choice, and what it actually cost you to make it. I read every single one, even the ones that are hard to read. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in bed running the conversation back over and over, listening for a lie I never actually found. My sister had sounded exactly as blindsided as I had once been myself, and at the time, I had absolutely no reason in the world to doubt her. I filed that phone call away as proof that at least one person in my family had never fully understood the machine she had grown up benefiting from. I would not learn how incomplete that belief actually was for quite a while longer, and when I finally did, the shape of what I owed her, and what she owed me, was going to look nothing like I imagined it that night. I called Aunt Roberta the next night, the moment she heard my voice. Before I had said more than her name, she knew something had happened, because our entire ritual for 5 years had been one wordless postcard a year, nothing more. And now here I was actually speaking. They found me, I said, and I told her everything, the cafe, the coffee I had poured them, the recall notice disguised as wonderful news. She was quiet for a long moment on her end of the line. Then my aunt took a slow breath, the kind you take before you finally pay off a debt that has been sitting on the books for far too long, and she gave me the rest of the story I had only ever heard half of, standing in a dark hallway at 12 years old. "You were 12, she said. "You came downstairs for water that night. I know you heard some of it. Here is the rest. That summer," she told me, she had offered to take me in for the entire school year, not a visit, enrolled at the school in Birch Harbor, my own room at her house, everything paid for entirely out of her own pocket, so that my parents would be free to focus on my sister without a single obligation left over for me. She had the paperwork half-drafted before she ever picked up the phone. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say for nearly 2 weeks before she finally dialed my mother's number. My mother heard the entire proposal from start to finish and rejected it outright. Missing me too much was never the justification she offered. The actual reason preserved word for word in Roberta's memory across 19 years was simply, "That's not how it would look. Permanently relocating a daughter," my mother had reasoned, was the sort of arrangement neighbors would start asking pointed questions about. Sending her off for summers, meanwhile, read as ordinary, wholesome, practically indistinguishable from cousins' camp. 8 summers turned out to be exactly the maximum dose of my absence the family portrait could absorb without tilting visibly off its nail. My whole childhood, it turned out, had been rationed out to the precise edge of what appearances could tolerate, measured the way a baker measures flour, never a spoonful more than the bowl could hold. I asked Roberta if she remembered the exact date of that call, and she did, instantly, without having to think about it at all. The way you remember the date of anything that changes the shape of a relationship you have spent years pretending is unchanged. She had marked it privately as the year she stopped fully trusting her own sister's version of what love was supposed to look like inside that particular family. She had kept showing up anyway, every June, suitcase and all, because the alternative was letting a little girl learn that even the one safe house had limits, too. I stood in my own kitchen in Montana, holding the phone, finally doing the one piece of arithmetic I had never once let myself do all the way through before. It had never been thoughtlessness. It had never been an accident of grief or exhaustion left over from the illness years. It had been policy, decided once, and quietly renewed every June for 8 years, running without a single review. Then Roberta said the other thing, the thing that mattered more than the explanation itself. "I should have fought harder for you, sweetheart. I have carried that for a long time." She paused. "Come with me to Thanksgiving this year, not for their sake, so you can finally stop wondering, once and for all, who you might have become if somebody had actually made room for you at that table." I asked her why she had never told me any of this sooner. In 19 years of birthdays and postcards and phone calls that carefully never touched the subject. She was quiet again, longer this time. And when she finally answered, her voice had lost some of its usual steadiness. Because telling a 12-year-old that her mother chose appearances over her would have broken something in you I did not know how to put back together at the time, and later, once you were grown. I told myself the moment had already passed, that dragging it back up would only reopen a door you had worked so hard to shut. She exhaled slowly. I see now that keeping quiet was its own kind of choosing appearances. I am not proud of that. I want you to know I see it. I did not have a ready answer for that. So I let the silence sit between us for a while. The way she had always been so good at doing herself. Outside my kitchen window, the lake was doing the thing it did every night around that hour, going flat and dark and enormous all at once, and I found myself grateful, in a strange, wordless way, that at least one person from that entire chapter of my life was finally choosing honesty over comfort, even 19 years late. "I'll come," I told her. "Not for them, for you." And even as I said it, some careful, calculating part of my brain had already started quietly running the numbers on what a plane ticket and 3 weeks away from the cafe would actually cost me, down to the last dollar. The way it always did whenever a decision threatened to cost me something I could not easily get back. I did not sleep much for 3 nights after that call. I would like to tell you, the debate keeping me awake was entirely about my parents, but honestly, most of it circled back to a sheet of graph paper taped to the inside of my closet door. $44,150. That is where the number stood, $1,850 short of finally shaking Margot's hand on the sale of the cafe. After 4.5 years of resold boots and streaming services I had never once let myself subscribe to. Going back to Indiana was not simply a plane ticket. It was a breach somewhere in the entire hull of the life I had spent 5 years quietly building, plank by plank, out of sheer stubbornness and diner tips. And I knew myself well enough by then to understand exactly why the idea terrified me so completely. If that house ever got its hooks back into me, even for a single holiday weekend, the steady one buried inside me would revert to her oldest habits without hesitation. Absorb, accommodate, vanish while still technically standing in the room. A specific brand of disappearing I had somehow never once attempted. Despite years of practice at the other kind, I ran the numbers a dozen different ways during those 3 sleepless nights. The way I run numbers on everything. Because numbers had always been the one language in my life that never once lied to me or softened anything for my comfort. If I dipped into the down payment fund for the flight and the rental car, I would lose another 2 months on the cafe timeline. If I asked my landlord for an extension on rent instead, I would be doing the one thing I had sworn never to do again after that first winter with the broken heater, which was owe somebody something I could not immediately repay in full. I thought, too, about the version of myself who had once stood in a kitchen at 11 years old delivering a rehearsed speech to a mother who had already made her decision hours earlier. I did not want to fly 2,000 miles only to discover I was still underneath the resoled boots in the framed magazine article. That same girl asking permission for something that had already been decided without her. On the 4th morning, I finally did something my adult life had never once required of me before. I asked for help out loud, the complete, unedited truth attached to the request rather than some smaller, safer version of it. I sat Margot down at her own corner table before we opened for the day, and I told her everything. Indiana, the summers, the suitcase, my father's shaking hand. The exact figure taped inside my closet, and precisely what I feared a week around Thanksgiving might cost me, in both money and nerve. She heard me all the way through without interrupting once, arms crossed the whole time, the same posture she used when she was deciding whether a batch of dough was worth saving or not. When I finally stopped talking, she was quiet for a moment, studying me the way she studied a new hire during their first week, deciding how much weight a person could actually bear before you handed them something heavy. "The cafe's been here 40 years, she finally said. "It can wait 3 more weeks." And then, because Margot has never once in her life failed to land dead center on the actual point, she added, "Can you?" I did not have a fast answer for that question, which told me something about myself I had been avoiding for years. I had built an entire adult life around never once needing anyone to wait for me. And here was a woman I trusted, asking me plainly whether I could survive 3 weeks of a debt sitting unpaid on a piece of graph paper. I told her yes before I had fully decided it was true, the way you sometimes have to say a thing out loud before you can actually make yourself believe it. I booked the flight that same afternoon, Kalispell to Indianapolis, the day before Thanksgiving. The fare alone ate into the graph paper number more than I wanted to admit to myself while I typed my card information into the airline's website, but I booked it anyway, and I did not let myself recalculate the total a second time once it was done. Then I did something I could not fully explain to myself in the moment, something I only understood much later. Once I finally understood what the whole trip was actually going to cost me, and what it was going to give back in return. I pulled the green suitcase out from under my bed, where it had sat retired and completely empty for nearly 5 years, gathering dust in a corner I mostly avoided looking at. I packed it for the trip east, folding my clothes into it the way Aunt Roberta had once folded mine, careful and unhurried. Walking back into that house, even for 3 short days, I decided, meant walking in with the exact luggage they had trained into me as a child. Call it evidence. Call it a witness standing quietly in the corner of my own story, the way the cookie tin had been for years already. Some things you carry with you on purpose, and some things, I was only just starting to learn, end up carrying you right back to exactly where they first found you. Aunt Roberta met me at the Indianapolis airport, and catching sight of her in the arrivals area, grayer now, sweeping the crowd of faces with the same searching look she used to give a crowded beach when I was small, unraveled more of my composure than the entire 5-hour flight had managed on its own. We hugged for longer than either of us probably intended to, and neither of us said anything about it afterward. We got a motel room near the interstate that night, plain carpet and a coffee maker that smelled faintly of the last person who used it. And I want that detail noticed, because it mattered more than it might sound like it should. 2 grown women, both with family less than 20 minutes away by car. And we chose a motel anyway. Twin beds and a television bolted to the wall, because a boundary you cannot physically walk out of is not actually a boundary. It is just a guest room with someone else's name still on the lease. That evening, before the holiday itself, we stopped by my parents' house for what my mother called a courtesy visit, and my childhood home laid itself open, room by room, as we walked through it. Like a body being examined for a cause of death everyone already suspected. The hallway wall was covered in my sister at every possible age. Little league photos, prom, a picture from the day of her diagnosis turned remission bell ringing, her wedding day standing beside Derek in front of a rented arch of white flowers. I appeared exactly twice in that entire hallway, both times in class composite photographs, one small face among 24 others nobody would have picked out without already knowing which one to look for. My old bedroom had become a home office, repainted a soft gray, a corkboard mounted on one wall covered in paint swatches and printed photographs of staged living rooms. My sister's real estate mood board pinned up where my bed used to sit. My mother mentioned this brightly, as though she were delivering good news about a smart renovation, watching my face for a reaction I made sure not to give her. I noticed a framed real estate license hanging just above the old window seat where I used to read on rainy afternoons. My sister's name printed across it in a font meant to look official and trustworthy at the same time. Aunt Roberta stood very still in the doorway of that room for a moment longer than the tour required, and I caught her eyes moving once, quickly, toward the closet, before she said nothing at all and moved on toward the kitchen with the rest of us. I did not think much of it at the time. I had a great deal else competing for my attention that evening. Between the hallway of photographs and my mother's bright, relentless commentary on every room we passed through. And there, on top of the kitchen hutch, sat the other cookie tin. My mother's own postcards, the same 8 trips, duplicates of the very cards sitting in my own tin back in Montana, fanned out in a decorative wicker basket like a kind of potpourri, curated and displayed for any guest who happened to admire it. Our family, I realized standing there, had kept 2 separate archives of the exact same 8 summers. Hers sat in a basket for company to admire on their way to the bathroom. Mine sat above my own stove in Montana, with the truth written on the back of every single card in my own handwriting. My father accompanied me out to the car when we finally left that evening. Beneath the same porch fixture that had once lit the way for a green suitcase carried up those very steps years before, he pressed a small, tightly folded square of paper into my palm, creased down in that particular manner men of his generation use for anything they cannot manage to say aloud instead. His hand trembled against mine the whole time, though I couldn't tell whether it was the illness or simply the moment itself doing it. "Read it later," was the only thing he offered. I tucked the folded square into my coat pocket, and it stayed there the rest of the night, a small, steady pressure against my ribs, something I had apparently agreed to carry before I understood what it actually weighed. Roberta drove us back to the motel in silence for the first few minutes, both of us watching the same familiar strip malls slide past the windows in the dark. Finally, she asked, carefully, whether I was still glad I had come. I told her I did not know yet, which was the truest answer I had. Some trips, I was learning, do not hand you their verdict until they are almost finished with you. I did not open my father's note that night. I told myself it was because I was too tired from the flight, but the truth was simpler and less flattering. I was afraid that whatever was folded inside that paper would either break something in me before Thanksgiving even started, or worse, turn out to be nothing at all. One more unfinished sentence in a family full of them. I set my coat over the back of the motel chair, the paper still tucked inside the pocket, and I lay awake a long time listening to the traffic on the interstate outside, thinking about a hallway with 2 photographs of me and dozens of my sister, and about a woman who had once, briefly, glanced toward a closet like it held something worth remembering. I woke up early the next morning, Thanksgiving morning itself, before Roberta had even stirred in the other bed, and I finally unfolded my father's note at the small motel desk with the lamp turned low so I would not wake her. It was not a letter. It was a single sheet, a printed property valuation from a title company, the kind of document that gets generated whenever somebody looks into refinancing a house or adding a name to a deed. My parents' address printed at the top in a plain sans serif font, a valuation figure I made myself read twice, just to be sure I had not misread a decimal point. And near the bottom, a small table listing the names currently attached to the title, printed in the flat. Indifferent formatting of a document never meant for anyone outside a law office to actually read closely. My mother's name, my father's name, and a third name I did not expect to see there at all, printed in the same flat font as everything else, as if it belonged there just as naturally as the other 2. My sister's, added as a joint owner, dated 11 years earlier, right around the time she had married Derek. There was nothing else on the page. No note in my father's handwriting explaining what it meant. No context. Nothing except the bare fact of it sitting there in cold, official print. I sat with that sheet of paper for a long time, turning it over as if the back might explain the front, the way I had once turned over a scratched postcard in a motel room 2,000 miles away, and found no more answers there either. I tried to imagine the moment he had decided to hand this to me. My father was not a man who searched through filing cabinets out of idle curiosity. He kept exactly what he needed and nothing more, the same way he had kept his opinions to himself for most of my childhood. The whole orchestra of nothing. I had grown up learning to read like a second language. For him to have found this document, printed it, folded it small enough to hide inside his coat, and then pressed it into my hand under a porch light without a single word of explanation. Something about it must have been eating at him for longer than one evening. I thought about the way his hand had trembled against mine when he passed it over. I told myself it was only the disease. Some smaller, more honest part of me suspected it might have been both things at once. The tremor and the nerve it must have taken him to do something so quietly out of character. I did not know, sitting in that chair, exactly what to do with it. I had no idea whether my father had given it to me because he wanted me to understand something specific, or because some part of him simply needed somebody else to be carrying the weight of it besides himself, even for one single night. I folded the paper back along its original creases and tucked it into the inside pocket of my coat, deciding, for the moment, to say nothing about it to anyone. Thanksgiving dinner, with its swan-folded napkins and its careful seating chart, did not feel like the place to raise a question I did not yet have the right words for, and some part of me suspected I would need more than a single morning to even find them. Roberta stirred awake not long after and caught me sitting very still at the desk. She asked if everything was all right. I told her yes, mostly meaning it, and did not mention the paper at all. I have wondered many times whether that was the right call. Keeping it folded and quiet through breakfast, through the drive over, through the first hour of a dinner table set with the good china and cloth napkins folded into careful fan shapes at every place setting. I still do not have a clean answer. Some information, once you are holding it, does not come with instructions for when to finally put it down on the table in front of everyone else. Over coffee that morning, Roberta noticed I was somewhere else entirely, and she asked, gently, whether I wanted to talk about whatever was sitting behind my eyes. I almost told her right there in that motel breakfast nook, surrounded by the smell of burnt coffee and cheap wallpaper glue. Something stopped me, some instinct I did not fully trust yet but had learned, over the years, not to override without good reason. I think I already sensed, without being able to say so out loud, that whatever this document meant, it was going to need more than one quiet motel breakfast to survive being said. I folded it back into my coat pocket instead, and I told her I was only tired from the flight, which was true enough to pass for the whole truth if neither of us looked at it too closely. We drove to my parents' house a little after noon, past the same strip malls from the night before, now decorated with sagging inflatable turkeys that had clearly seen better Novembers. I kept one hand resting against my coat pocket the entire ride, feeling the stiff edge of that folded page through the fabric, wondering how many other pieces of paper might be sitting in filing cabinets and drawers throughout that house, waiting for someone brave enough or simply tired enough to finally go looking for them. Thanksgiving arrived exactly the way my mother always produced holidays, camera ready down to the last detail, the way a television network rolls out its biggest special of the year. Both leaves were in the dining table. The good china came out, the set with the thin gold rim she only used twice a year. Cloth napkins were folded into careful fan shapes at every place setting, standing upright in the water glasses like small white sails. Every recurring character from my childhood had been invited back for the occasion. My mother's cousin Ray and his wife, who I had not seen since before I left. Two more of my mother's cousins whose names I had to relearn on the spot. A neighbor from 2 doors down that my mother had been collecting for every major holiday since I was a child, the way some people collect stamps. And my sister's family, Cass and Derek, arriving 20 minutes late with an apology about traffic that nobody in the room seemed to actually mind. Their daughter stayed home that afternoon with a babysitter, down for her nap schedule, Cass explained while hanging up her coat, and I remember thinking, distantly, that I still had never actually met my own niece in person, 4 years into her life. A fact that said something about this family I did not yet have the full sentence for. I came with Aunt Roberta, carrying a huckleberry pie in a plain white bakery box. The crust crimped the exact way she had taught my hands to crimp one nearly 20 years earlier at a kitchen table 4 hours from anywhere that had ever felt safe to me before. If you think that pie was simply dessert, you have not been listening closely enough to this story. My hands had made it, her hands had taught mine. That pie was about to occupy the exact center of my mother's table, which meant that for one entire afternoon, every version of me, the girl on the porch, the woman behind the counter, this reluctant guest, would all end up stacked on a single trivet together. My mother greeted us at the door wearing her Sunday service smile at maximum brightness, throwing the whole entryway into one warm, rehearsed glow. "There she is, our world traveler," she announced to no one in particular, loud enough for the whole living room to hear over the football game playing on the television. "Doesn't Montana agree with her?" A few heads turned my way, a few polite compliments followed about how well I looked, and I smiled back the way you smile at strangers complimenting a costume you did not choose to wear. My father sat at the head of the table once we finally moved into the dining room, and I watched his tremor negotiate quietly with the water glasses every time someone nearby spoke a little too loudly or laughed a little too suddenly. He caught me watching once, and I looked away before either of us had to acknowledge it out loud. For the first hour, it went, honestly, fine. Fine the way a glass looks fine right up until the moment it finally cracks. Small talk about the drive, about Ray's ongoing opinions on interstate construction, about whether the stuffing needed more sage this year than last, about a neighbor's new roof and whether the contractor had overcharged her. My sister sat near the middle of the table, polite and slightly too bright, glancing my way every so often with an expression I could not fully read yet, somewhere between guilt and genuine warmth. And at the time, I still assumed it was entirely the second one. I found myself watching her more closely than I meant to, running the folded valuation sheet in my coat pocket against every small gesture she made. Every time she reached for the gravy, or laughed at one of Derek's jokes a half-second too late. I could not yet tell whether I was looking at a woman who had simply been handed something without asking for it 11 years earlier, or a woman who had known exactly what she was signing at the time and had spent a decade being comfortable with that knowledge. I told myself to wait. I told myself this was not the table for that particular conversation. Not yet. Maybe not ever, depending on how the rest of the afternoon went. Roberta sat beside me, quiet in the specific way she got quiet whenever she was reading a room more carefully than she let on. And once, when my mother's laugh rang out a little too sharp across the table, I saw my aunt's jaw tighten the same way it used to when I was 12 years old and did not yet understand what that particular tightness meant. My father, for his part, mostly watched his own plate throughout that first hour, occasionally lifting his water glass with both hands to keep it steady on the way to his mouth. Once, briefly, his eyes met mine across the table, and something passed between us that neither of us said out loud. An acknowledgement, maybe, that we were both sitting on something the rest of the table had no idea existed yet. Then the turkey landed on the table, golden and enormous on my mother's largest serving platter, and the potatoes started their slow trip from hand to hand around the table, and my mother stood up at the head of her end of the table, picked up her wineglass, and tapped it twice with the edge of her fork, the sound cutting cleanly through every other conversation in the room at once. "Before we start," my mother said, lifting her wineglass a notch higher, "I want to share something wonderful with everyone here. What you have to understand about the two of us is this. We had each shown up at that table carrying our own separate announcement. She simply assumed hers was the only one anybody would still remember by the time dessert came out. She built the news in 2 distinct beats, like a woman who had practiced the whole thing in front of a bathroom mirror the same way I once rehearsed a plea about Zion National Park at 11. First came the somber note. As some of you already know, Walter's been dealing with some health issues, and the doctors have now confirmed it's Parkinson's. The table responded exactly the way tables respond to news like that, a collective intake of breath. Ray's wife, pressing a hand to her own collarbone, murmured fragments of, "Oh, Walter," and, "Diane, I'm so sorry to hear it. My father kept his eyes on his plate through the whole exchange, the way a person studies something being discussed at their own memorial while still, technically, breathing in the room. Then my mother raised her chin and pivoted smoothly into the triumphant note, the actual reason she'd driven 2,000 miles to Montana and back in the first place. But here's the wonderful part, she announced, letting a satisfied beat of silence hang there before finishing. Nora's coming home to help look after her father, and since she has never once passed up a chance to add a flourish, she tacked on, she's always been the steady one. The table erupted in precisely the reaction she'd engineered. Ray lifted his beer and shouted something congratulatory. One of my mother's cousins actually clapped 3 neat little pats. The neighbor dabbed at her eye with a corner of her folded napkin and announced, "To the room in general." Now that's a devoted daughter. My mother absorbed every bit of it with a slow, gracious nod, a conductor accepting applause for an orchestra she alone had assembled, her palm settling onto my shoulder like a wax seal pressed onto a finished contract. I scanned that table, a dozen faces glowing over a sentence describing my own future that had never once, not for a single second, actually been posed to me as a question. I waited for the last small laugh to fully die out before saying anything, because 4 years of running my own business had taught me exactly one transferable skill. You never compete with a room's volume. You drop yours until the room has no option but to lean in toward you instead. You're right about one thing, Mom, I said. Once the quiet had settled enough, I never once caused a scene. I let that breathe. Instead, I built an entire life. And because I finally held the floor at that table, 23 years into functioning as background furniture inside that house, I kept each sentence short, setting them down one by one like table settings. I'm not moving back home. Ray opened his mouth and visibly reconsidered. But nobody leaving this table tonight gets to say I left my father shaking through dinner with no one looking after him. Here's what's actually happening instead. I explained that I'd already spent the previous week arranging a licensed, bonded home care service out of Indianapolis, the exact agency his own neurologist's office had recommended. 3 mornings weekly to start, adjustable as things progressed. The billing would route straight to me in Montana, already scheduled. First visit Monday. I did not mention the actual cost to the table. I'll mention it to you, since you've earned the number by now. It matched the figure taped inside my closet door almost exactly. Most of a down payment, years of resold boots, every streaming subscription I'd denied myself. 4.5 years of deliberate frugality, rerouted in one phone call I'd made 3 days earlier from a gas station lot outside Bozeman. My mother's expression cycled through her entire catalog at once. Wounded, then something bordering on judicial, before she finally reached for the gavel. "After everything this family has sacrificed for you," she began. I kept my voice level the whole time. "You handed me a suitcase, Mom, every single June." It came out quiet enough that the whole table leaned forward to catch it, and then the sentence finished landing inside a silence where not one fork moved. Second, I would visit my father twice yearly and call him every Sunday, arriving each time as an invited guest, never a summons. And third, my name was withdrawn, starting immediately, from any family announcement made without my knowledge ahead of time. "That covers the entire arrangement," I said. "There's no version of this open for negotiation." My mother set her wine glass down against the tablecloth with a sharp little click and reached for the one exit she'd clearly been holding in reserve since before I ever walked through the door that afternoon. "Walk out of this house tonight," she said, "and don't expect an invitation back." There it was, The complete bill finally itemized in front of 12 witnesses and a plate of cooling turkey. The daughter quietly bankrolling her father's nurse would become, in whatever version circulated at church the following Sunday, simply the daughter who abandoned her sick father on a holiday. I knew exactly which version she'd tell before the front door had even shut behind me, and sitting right there, I decided the cost was one I was willing to pay. "Mom, I stopped belonging to this address the summer I turned 8, I said, and every word of it was true. Into that silence, my sister's voice rose, unsteady, trying visibly to gather the wreckage of the moment back into something manageable before her mother's ultimatum finished landing on everyone at once. "Nora, it's not like you're losing anything. The house situation is already—" She cut herself off mid-sentence. A beat too late. The particular kind of stopping that happens only after the words are already loose in the room, and there's no calling them back. Beside her, Derek had gone very still, staring hard at his own plate. I turned to look at her directly. "What house situation?" "Cass." She did not answer right away. It was Aunt Roberta who spoke first, from the far end of the table. Her voice quiet, but perfectly clear in the silence that had swallowed everything else. "A piece of that house for each of you girls," she said slowly, repeating a sentence none of us had heard out loud in nearly 2 decades. "Isn't that what your grandfather used to say, Diane? Don't you forget it," he told them. At his own birthday party, more than once, my mother's face went pale in a way I had genuinely never seen it go before. Not once. In 23 years of watching her manage every room she ever walked into. Ray's wife looked down at her own plate, suddenly very interested in her cranberry sauce. The neighbor woman had gone still with her fork halfway to her mouth. Even the football game murmuring from the living room television seemed, for a moment, like the only thing in the house still willing to make noise. My father's hand, I noticed, had stopped shaking entirely, the way a held breath sometimes steadies a tremor for a few seconds longer than usual. He was watching my sister with an expression I recognized instantly, because I had worn that exact expression myself, years earlier, standing at the top of a staircase looking down at a suitcase nobody had asked me about yet. Cass set down her fork. When she finally spoke, it came out smaller than anything I had ever heard from her. All the practiced real estate confidence gone out of it entirely. 11 years ago, she said. When Derek and I got married, Mom and Dad added me to the deed. Joint ownership. I didn't ask for it. I didn't fight it either. A pause, longer this time. And lately, I've been talking to them about refinancing. A reverse mortgage, so they'd have more cash flow as they get older. My name's already on the paperwork as the listing agent of record if it ever gets sold. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was just handling things, the way somebody in this family always has to. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to anymore. I simply sat very still, letting the old sentence from a dead man at a birthday party finally line up against the sentence I had read alone at a motel desk that same morning, and against the wicker basket of duplicate postcards sitting on a kitchen hutch less than a mile from where we were now sitting. Only one daughter, it turned out, had ever actually received her piece of that house. The other one had not even known such a piece existed to be given, let alone been asked whether she wanted one. I thought, in that strange, suspended second, of my grandfather's cane squeaking against the linoleum, of a joke I had laughed off politely at 14 because a countdown notebook at home felt far more urgent that afternoon than an old man's riddle. He had tried, in his own limited way, to make sure both of us knew. Somewhere between his funeral and this table, that promise had quietly become a private arrangement instead, handled the way our family handled everything uncomfortable, by simply not mentioning it to the one person it would have hurt most to leave out. I did not raise my voice for the second half of what I said either. I'm not going to fight you for the house, Cass. I don't want it, and I don't need it. I let that land before I finished. But trust doesn't automatically refill itself just because nobody says anything for 11 years. I stood, thanked my mother for the meal in a tone flat enough that everyone at the table understood exactly how much gratitude was actually inside it, and asked Aunt Roberta if she was ready to go. I did not look back at my mother again before I turned toward the front hall. I did not need to see her face a second time to know exactly which version of this evening she was already beginning to compose in her head. The one where the ungrateful daughter had ruined a lovely dinner over an old man's joke and a piece of paperwork that meant nothing at all. Let her compose it. I had a folded valuation sheet in my coat pocket that told a far more precise story than any speech she could give at church next Sunday. Aunt Roberta got our coats without being asked, moving with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had clearly been ready to leave a table like that one for a very long time, possibly her entire life. My father did not walk us out this time. I understood why, and I did not hold it against him. Some men only have one hard thing in them per holiday, and he had already spent his on a folded piece of paper under a porch light the night before. We were in the car before either of us said another word, the porch light shrinking in the rearview mirror behind us. The same light that had once watched a green suitcase get carried up those steps for the very first time. 8 summers had taught me how to survive a family that decided things about my life without ever once inviting me into the room. Thanksgiving taught me something new to sit beside that old lesson. Sometimes the people quietly deciding things without you are not the ones you expected at all. And sometimes the receipts you need most are not hiding in a lawyer's office, but folded inside your own coat pocket the entire time, waiting only for you to finally be brave enough to unfold them at the right table. I flew back to Montana believing the hardest chapter of this story had already closed behind me at that dinner table. I was wrong. There was still one more paper nobody in that house had ever found the courage to hand me directly, and it was not sitting in any drawer inside that home at all. It was sitting, of all places, inside a lawyer's filing cabinet 2 states away, waiting patiently for a phone call I did not yet know I was about to receive. One that would finally connect a scratched-out sentence on an old postcard to a debt none of us had ever known was still technically outstanding. Back in Whitefish, I finalized the home care arrangement for my father within the first week. Exactly the way I had promised that table full of witnesses I would 3 mornings a week to start. An aide named Patrice, a licensed agency out of Indianapolis with a coordinator who called me every Friday afternoon with a short, professional update. Roughly $420 a week, once everything was totaled. Invoices arriving by email directly to me instead of routing through anyone else's mailbox first. Let me be straight about what that figure actually did to my own timeline, since I promised you accuracy going into this. Not a tidy bow. And accuracy sometimes requires admitting the math didn't resolve nearly as cleanly as anyone watching from outside might assume. $420 a week eats into a graph paper savings number with a kind of quiet, relentless patience that no single large expense ever quite matches. Margot's handshake, the one I had been working toward for 4.5 years of Rieseled boots and unclaimed streaming subscriptions, moved further out on the calendar with every invoice that landed in my inbox. I did not regret the decision for one single morning. I simply want you to understand that boundaries, the healthy kind, the kind people love to talk about in general terms, often come with a real, specific recurring dollar amount attached to them. And mine came attached to $420 every single week, for as long as my father needed it. I told Margot about the delay the same week I got back. Sitting across from her at the same corner table where I had once confessed the whole story before Thanksgiving. She listened, nodded once, and told me the offer on the cafe would stand for as long as it needed to stand, that she had no interest in selling 40 years of her life's work to anyone who had not already proven, in exactly the way I just had, what she was willing to sacrifice for the people she loved. It was not pity in her voice. It was something closer to respect, and I found I could accept that version of it without flinching, which was new for me. She had run that cafe through 2 recessions and 1 flood that took out half the North Shore parking lot. And she had a way of making patience sound like the most practical decision in the room rather than a sacrifice, which somehow made it easier for me to actually believe her. I set up the invoices to route directly into a separate account I opened specifically for my father's care, something I could track down to the penny without ever having to ask my mother a single question about how the money was being spent, or whether it was being spent at all. That detail mattered more to me than I expected it to going in. Control, I was starting to understand, was not the same thing as distrust. It was simply the shape love took in a family where trust had already been spent past its limit once before, and where every dollar, from now on, was going to be traceable back to exactly where it went and exactly why. There was a warmth to it too, though, one I had not expected going in. Patrice started that first Monday, and by Wednesday, my father had figured out how to attach a photograph to a text message on his old flip phone, a skill that clearly took him most of the afternoon to master, judging by how blurry and poorly framed the first attempt turned out to be. It showed the 2 of them at his kitchen table, both squinting hard into the lens like a pair of hostages forced into a ransom photo, the caption underneath reading, "Patrice runs a tighter ship than the whole auto plant ever did." It was, as far as I could recall, the longest joke my father had made in over a decade. I saved that photograph to a folder on my phone I had not needed before that week, one I simply labeled Dad, small, strange, ordinary happiness, arriving in the exact same month as everything else this story was about to hand me. I called him that first Sunday under the new arrangement, right on schedule, and he picked up on the second ring, which was new too. We talked for maybe 15 minutes about nothing important. The weather in Indiana, a neighbor's dog that kept getting into the trash, Patrice's opinion on the correct way to make scrambled eggs. Neither of us mentioned the folded valuation sheet, or my mother, or the dinner table. I did not bring it up, and neither did he. Some conversations, I was learning, do not need to happen all at once to still count as real ones. Sometimes they happen in 15-minute pieces, once a week, until eventually there is enough material built up between 2 people to finally have the larger conversation properly. I hung up that first Sunday feeling something I did not immediately have a name for, and it took me most of the drive back to the cafe to finally place it. It was simple, uncomplicated relief. The specific kind that comes from doing exactly what you said you were going to do, on schedule, without anyone else's permission required first. I parked outside the cafe for a minute longer than necessary before going in, just sitting with that feeling, letting it settle all the way down before I went back to work. The call from the lawyer came on an ordinary Tuesday in early December, nearly 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, while I was elbow-deep in pie dough and only answered because the area code looked vaguely familiar. His name was Pruitt, he explained, and he was finishing up the paperwork on my late grandfather Earl's estate, a process that had apparently been dragging on quietly for years. the way estates sometimes do when nobody is in a hurry to close them. "I was listed," he said, "as a minor secondary beneficiary, entitled to sign off on a final accounting before everything could officially close." Most of the call was exactly as dry as that sentence sounds. Line items, account numbers, a small sum from an old savings bond that would be transferred to me once I signed and returned a form he was emailing over that same afternoon. I stood at the prep counter, balancing the phone between my ear and my shoulder, only half listening, honestly, wiping flour off the screen between sentences whenever I switched hands, until he mentioned something almost as an afterthought. The way you mention something you assume the other person on the line already knows perfectly well. Pruitt had a voice built for exactly this kind of call, unhurried, mild, the voice of a man who had read thousands of estate documents aloud to thousands of distracted relatives, and long ago stopped expecting anyone to be fully present for all of it. I liked him immediately, in the brief, professional way you like anyone whose entire job is to finally tell you the truth about numbers other people have spent years trying to keep vague. "There was also the old Halloran Summer Care Fund," he said. "That closed out years ago. Just so you're aware, in case you ever wondered where your aunt's grocery money came from those summers you stayed with her. I stopped wiping flour off anything." "I'm sorry," I said. "The what?" He explained it the way lawyers explain things they assume are common family knowledge, matter of fact, slightly surprised at having to explain it at all. "My grandfather," he said, "had set up a modest standing fund years earlier, specifically earmarked to cover the cost of my summer stays with my aunt, room, board, incidentals, so that neither she nor my parents would be out of pocket for housing me every June through August." The fund had been drawn against steadily for years, a set amount released each June, then finally closed out and folded into the general estate once I turned 18 and the summers themselves finally stopped. "Your grandfather was very particular about it, from what's in the file," Pruitt added, flipping pages somewhere on his end of the line. "Wanted it kept separate from the main household account. Made a point of it, actually, more than once, according to his own notes. I do not remember exactly what I said back to him. I know I asked one or two follow-up questions in a voice that must have sounded normal enough, because he answered them without any hesitation, without once picking up on the fact that the ground underneath the entire conversation had just shifted for me in a way he could not have possibly known about. I know I got off the phone somehow, professionally enough that he had no reason to suspect anything unusual had just happened on my end of the line. I know I stood in the middle of my own kitchen for a long time afterward, flour cooling on my hands, staring at nothing in particular. The way you stare when your body is still upright, but your mind has gone somewhere else entirely to sort through what it just heard. 18 years. 18 years of postcards and porches and a family motto about not stirring pots, and not one single person had ever once mentioned to me that there had been an actual fund, with an actual name, specifically set aside to make sure I was never a financial burden on anyone during those summers. I had spent years quietly assuming Aunt Roberta simply absorbed the cost out of love, and she had let me assume it, maybe because she genuinely did not know any better herself, or maybe because that particular silence had never once felt like hers to break. I thought about all the times my mother had described those summers as a gift she had given me, independence. She called it character. The greatest thing a parent could hand a daughter. I had always assumed that framing was simply how she chose to remember an arrangement that cost her nothing but a little guilt. It had never once occurred to me that the arrangement might have cost someone money the entire time, money that had existed specifically for my benefit, and that somewhere along the way, that money had apparently stopped going only toward me, I reached up to the shelf above my stove and pulled down the cookie tin before I had even consciously decided to do it. My hands already moving faster than my thoughts, flour still drying in pale streaks across my knuckles. I set it on the counter and stood there for a moment before opening it. The way you stand in front of a door you already suspect is going to change the room on the other side of it. Outside the window above the sink, a delivery truck was idling in the alley behind the cafe, completely indifferent to the fact that my entire understanding of 18 summers had just quietly shifted underneath me while I stood there holding a phone that had already gone silent. I found the third card without much searching. I had looked at it enough times over the years, in enough different lamplight, in a motel room and later in a studio apartment and now in a kitchen I actually owned, that my fingers went to the right spot in the stack almost entirely on their own. The Carolina boardwalk, faded now at the corners. The cardstock gone slightly soft the way old paper does after enough years of handling. I turned it over and read the scratched line again, slower this time than I had ever once read it before. The summer fund covers, I understood it now. Or at least I understood enough of it to feel something cold settle low in my stomach. My mother had started to write the truth on the back of a postcard meant for an 8-year-old. Some early summer, maybe out of guilt, maybe simply out of habit. The way you sometimes almost tell a child something true before catching yourself mid-sentence. And then she had stopped herself, scratched it out hard enough to tear the paper, and finished the card the way she finished all the others instead. 2 cheerful words. Nothing more. I wondered, sitting there with the card in my hand, whether she remembered writing that half-sentence at all, or whether it had simply vanished from her own memory the moment the pen lifted off the page, the way so many other things in that house seemed to vanish the instant they became inconvenient to keep holding on to. I called Aunt Roberta that same evening. I read her the line exactly as it was written, letter for letter, not trusting myself to summarize it in case I got some small detail wrong that mattered. She went quiet on her end of the line for long enough that I asked if she was still there. When she finally spoke, her voice had a strange, careful flatness to it, the sound of someone doing arithmetic out loud for the first time in nearly 2 decades. "I always wondered," she said slowly, "how your parents managed to send your sister on every single one of those trips. Even in years when I knew for a fact your father's hours had been cut back at the plant. I used to think Diane was simply better with money than she let on. I never once thought to ask where the difference was actually coming from. I asked her the question I already suspected I knew the answer to, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. In 18 years, had my parents ever once sent her money for my room and board during those summers? Groceries, utilities, new shoes when I outgrew the old ones halfway through July, anything at all. "Not one check," Roberta said. "Not $1. Not in 18 years. I never asked, because asking felt like putting a price on you, and I never wanted you to feel like a bill anyone in this family had to settle. I told myself I was doing it out of love, and I was, sweetheart, I want you to know that part was always completely true, every single summer of it. But now I'm sitting here in my own kitchen wondering exactly how much love I was quietly subsidizing for people who apparently had the actual money the whole time and simply chose, year after year, not to send a single dollar of it my way. Neither of us said my sister's name out loud during that call, not once. Though I suspect we were both circling the exact same shape in our own separate silences, waiting to see which one of us would say it first. Neither of us did. Some accusations, I was learning, need more than a scratched postcard and a phone call to earn the right to be spoken aloud. Before we hung up, Roberta asked me what I planned to do with what I now knew. I told her the truth, which was that I did not know yet. Part of me wanted to call my mother immediately and read her the scratched line over the phone, the same way I had just read it to my aunt, and demand she finish the sentence she had started and abandoned so many years earlier. A larger, quieter part of me understood that confronting her over the phone would only hand her the exact kind of controlled setting she was best at managing, a call she could end whenever she chose to, on her own terms, in her own home, with nobody else there to witness whatever she decided to say or not say. "Give it some time," Roberta said finally. "Whatever this is, it's been sitting quietly for 18 years already. It will keep a little longer while you figure out the right way to bring it into a room instead of down a phone line." I told her I would think about it. I did think about it, more than she probably realized, for the better part of the following week, turning the whole shape of it over in my mind at odd hours, while proofing dough before sunrise, while restocking the pastry case, while lying awake long after closing. The same way I once turned that postcard over and over under a motel lamp, looking for an answer that was clearly not going to arrive until I finally went looking for it directly, in person, at a table where nobody could simply hang up the phone on me. I did not want to turn this into another Thanksgiving, a second-staged confrontation in front of a table full of people who had absolutely nothing to do with any of it, and would only end up carrying home a story that was not theirs to tell at their own dinner parties. Cousin Ray did not need a second act. The neighbor with her fan-folded napkin did not need to watch a second sentence detonate over the good china. Whatever I decided to do with what I now knew about the summer fund, I wanted it to happen quietly, between the three of us, without an audience deciding afterward which version of the evening they preferred to repeat at church. I settled, after several more days of turning it over, on my father's upcoming birthday in January. A small dinner my mother always kept modest by her own standards compared to the holidays. Just family, no cousins, no neighbors dropping by uninvited, no good china with the gold rim brought down from the high cabinet. I called to say I would be flying in for it. My mother sounded surprised, then pleased, then, within the same breath, already halfway to planning a slightly larger version of the evening than either of us had actually agreed to. I told her, gently but firmly, that I wanted it small. She let it go faster than I expected her to, which told me something had shifted in her too, even if neither of us was ready to name what. While I waited for January, the flip phone photographs from my father kept arriving, steady and a little more confident with each attempt, like a man slowly getting the hang of a skill he had decided, late in life, was worth the trouble of learning properly, even with hands that did not always want to cooperate with whatever he was pointing them at. One showed Patrice demonstrating a stretching exercise while my father attempted to follow along, his face caught mid-grimace. Another, blurrier than the rest, appeared to be an accidental photograph of his own shoe, captioned only, "Patrice says I have the aim of a man half my age." Not a compliment. A third photograph arrived a few days later, better composed than the others, clearly taken by Patrice herself rather than by my father's own unsteady hand. It showed him sitting on the porch, the same porch, in a coat too heavy for the mild December weather Indiana was apparently having that year, holding up a mug with my cafe's own logo printed on the side, the one I had mailed him weeks earlier without much explanation attached to it. His caption underneath read simply, "Best coffee I've had since your mother stopped letting me have the good stuff after 10 at night." I read that one 3 times before I finally put my phone down. I laughed out loud at that one, alone in my apartment, in a way that surprised me with how easily it came. It is strange, holding grief and tenderness for the same person in the same week, sometimes in the same hour. I was quietly furious at a man who had known about a fund meant for me, and never once said a word about where the missing pieces of it had gone. I was also, unmistakably, still fond of the man taking blurry photographs of his own shoe just to make his estranged daughter laugh from 2,000 miles away. Both of those things were true at once. And I decided, sometime during that quiet stretch of December, that I did not need to resolve which one of them mattered more before January arrived. Some feelings, I was learning, are allowed to simply sit next to each other, unreconciled, for as long as it takes to finally say the harder thing out loud. I spent part of that same December rehearsing quietly. The way I once rehearsed a speech about the Zion trip in a bathroom mirror at 11 years old, except this time the speech was barely 3 sentences long, and I was not asking anyone's permission for anything at all. I only wanted to ask a single question, plainly, without accusation dressed up as anger, and see what happened to my father's face when I finally did, whether it moved the way a guilty man's face moves or the way a tired man's face moves. Because I had begun to suspect those two things might look almost identical from across a dinner table. I bought his birthday gift in the first week of January, a set of thermal gloves designed for people with tremors, wide-cuffed and easy to pull on one-handed. Something Patrice had mentioned once in an offhand comment to the agency coordinator about how hard buttons and zippers had become for him that winter. It felt strange. Shopping for a man who had spent most of my childhood standing quietly in doorways, saying almost nothing. And yet here I was, thousands of miles away, trying to guess what might make one more of his mornings slightly easier. I wrapped the gloves myself, badly, using paper left over from a batch of gift boxes at the cafe. Corners folded crooked no matter how many times I tried to straighten them, and packed them into my carry-on beside the folded valuation sheet I still had not shown to anyone else, and the postcard with the scratched line, which I had decided, almost without meaning to, that I wanted to have with me in the room this time. The birthday dinner was exactly as small as my mother had promised. Just the 3 of us at the kitchen table instead of the dining room. No swan-folded napkins. An ordinary chocolate cake with a few candles instead of the elaborate desserts she reserved for holidays with an audience. My father unwrapped the gloves slowly, turning them over in his hands, testing the wide cuff against his own wrist before he looked up at me. "These are good ones," he said, quiet and genuine, and I could tell by the particular way he said it, without any of his usual deflection, that he understood exactly how much thought had gone into finding them, and exactly what it meant that his daughter had gone looking in the first place. We got through most of the meal on ordinary conversation, the cafe, Patrice's latest running joke, a home renovation show my mother had recently gotten into and now discussed with the enthusiasm most people reserve for actual family news. My father asked, almost shyly, whether I thought Whitefish would ever get direct flights from Indianapolis, and I told him I hoped so, mostly because I liked the shape of the question. A small, ordinary wish for easier access to a life he had never once seen in person. I let the meal breathe as long as I could stand to let it breathe. I did not want to open with the hardest thing in the room before anyone had even finished their plate. And some part of me, the part that still ran numbers on everything, wanted my father to have at least one full, uncomplicated birthday dinner before I changed the temperature of the room for good. After the cake, once my mother started clearing the smaller dessert plates and stacking them by the sink, I reached into my bag and set the postcard down on the table between us. Face up at first, the painted lake glowing under the kitchen light exactly the way it had glowed on the counter in Whitefish. Then I turned it over, slowly, so the scratched line sat facing my parents instead of me, giving them both a full 3 seconds to see it before I said a single word. What did the summer fund cover, Mom? I asked. I kept my voice even, almost gentle, the exact register I had learned. Over years of managing a small business gets you much further than volume ever does, especially with people who have spent a lifetime mistaking a raised voice for the only kind of seriousness worth responding to. My mother's hand stilled on the plate she was holding for exactly 1 second. No longer, before she recovered and set it down on the counter with perfect, practiced composure. The same composure that had carried her through 20 minutes of authorized family history at my own cafe counter months earlier. "That was so long ago, sweetheart," she said, already reaching for the lighter, more forgettable tones she used to smooth over anything inconvenient. "I don't even remember what—" My father set his fork down carefully, the way he did everything, as though the table itself might object to being handled too quickly. He did not say anything yet, but something in the room had already changed. The particular silence of a man who has just heard a sentence he has been quietly bracing himself against for far longer than anyone else at that table realized. His hand, resting on the edge of the table, began to shake harder than I had seen it shake all evening, harder even than at Thanksgiving. The tremor no longer content to stay confined to his fingers, moving now up through his wrist and forearm in a way that looked, for a moment, almost violent, his whole arm trembling against the tablecloth until he finally pressed his other hand down, flat on top of it to hold it still. My mother kept talking, filling the space the way she always filled space, mentioning something about how complicated old family finances always seemed in hindsight, how none of it mattered anymore anyway, how dwelling on old numbers never once did anyone a single bit of good. I did not interrupt her. I was watching my father instead, and some part of me already understood, before he said a single word, that whatever came out of him next was not going to be the version my mother had been curating in that house for 18 years. I thought, watching him, about every dinner table scene from my childhood where he had simply gone quiet instead of speaking. The whole orchestra of nothing I had grown up learning to read as its own kind of language. I had always assumed that silence meant he had nothing to say, or nothing he was allowed to say, boxed in by a wife who filled every available inch of a room the moment she opened her mouth. Watching his hand shake against the edge of that kitchen table, I began to wonder, for the first time in my life, whether his silence had actually been protecting something else entirely. Not me. Not even my mother. Just himself. And whatever arrangement he had quietly made his peace with a long time ago. My mother reached the end of her sentence about old family finances and looked between the two of us, perhaps sensing, finally, that the room had stopped following her lead. She opened her mouth to add something else, some further smoothing remark meant to close the subject entirely. She did not get the chance to finish it. My father set both hands flat on the table, pressing down hard, the way you brace a ladder before climbing it. And I understood, watching him do it, that he was trying to hold his own body still long enough to get through whatever came next. When he finally spoke, his voice came out slow, deliberate, each word placed like he was setting down something heavy he had been carrying for a very long time and did not want to drop. "I knew about the fund," he said. "Your grandfather set it up when you were small, right after your sister got sick, before any of this with the Summers even started. I knew from the beginning." My mother's composure finally cracked, not into tears, but into a sharp intake of breath. The sound of someone realizing a door she thought was locked had been standing open the entire time. "Walter," she said, a warning more than a name. He did not stop, I do not think, once he had finally started, that he could have stopped even if he had wanted to. Your mother told me more than once that using part of it to help cover your sister's trips was only fair, he continued, still looking at his own hands rather than at either of us. She said Cass needed it, after everything the illness took from her, the fear of it coming back, the way kids at school treated her different for a while after she lost her hair. She said the fund was just sitting there anyway, doing nothing, and family money should go where a family actually needs it. And you agreed, I said, not a question. I never agreed, he said, and something in his voice cracked open in a way I had never once heard from him in my entire life. I told myself that not stopping her wasn't the same thing as helping her do it. I told myself that for 18 years, Nora, I want you to understand, I never once believed it was right. I just never found the nerve to say so out loud. Not to your mother. Not to you. Not to anyone. The kitchen was completely silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator behind him. My mother had gone very still in her chair, staring at a point somewhere on the tablecloth, no longer trying to smooth anything over. Perhaps understanding, finally, that there was nothing left in that particular moment for her to manage. I was wrong for 18 years, my father said, and his hand, still pressed flat against the table, shook harder than I had ever seen it shake, disease and shame moving through him at the exact same time, indistinguishable from each other in that instant. I told myself keeping quiet wasn't the same as helping her do it. I was wrong. Keeping quiet was exactly the same thing, the whole time. And some part of me always knew it. I did not say anything for a long moment. I simply sat there, looking at the man who had carried a folded piece of paper under a porch light because he could not find the words to explain it any other way, and who had just found, finally, at his own birthday dinner, 18 years too late, the words themselves. I asked him, once I trusted my own voice again to stay level, how much of it had actually gone to my sister over all those years. He did not have an exact figure, he admitted, and I believed him, because a man capable of quoting me an exact figure would have been a man who had done the arithmetic on purpose, tracked it, planned it, and I did not think that was what had happened here. What had happened here was smaller and somehow worse, a slow erosion made of 100 small yeses over 18 years, none of them large enough on their own to feel like a real decision, until they added up to something that clearly was one. My mother finally spoke again, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it, none of the church register left in it at all. I told myself it evened things out, she said. Cass lost years of her childhood to that illness. You didn't. She stopped herself before finishing the thought, but I heard the rest of it anyway, the same way I had once heard the rest of a phone call through a dark hallway at 12 years old. You didn't lose anything, so you didn't need anything. The arithmetic of my entire childhood, finally spoken out loud in a kitchen instead of hidden behind a scratched-out line on a postcard. I lost 18 summers, Mom, I said quietly. I just didn't lose them to a disease. I lost them to a decision, made over and over every single June, by two people who were supposed to be adding things up in my favor, instead of quietly taking them away. Nobody said anything for a while after that. My father reached over, slowly, and put one shaking hand over mine on the table. Not asking for forgiveness. Not yet. Just wanting, I think, to be touching something true after 18 years of carrying something false. I let him. I did not pull away. And I did not lean in either. I simply let his hand stay there, trembling against mine, while the refrigerator hummed on behind him, and my mother sat across the table with nothing left to smooth over. I flew back to Montana 2 days later. A window seat again, a habit I had never once broken since that first flight out for Thanksgiving. And for most of that flight, I did not read, did not sleep, did not do much of anything except watch the clouds shift outside the glass and let my mind finally do the one kind of arithmetic I had never once let it finish before. Not the arithmetic of dollars this time, the arithmetic of people. Here is what I came to, somewhere over the Dakotas. At 31,000 feet, with a plastic cup of ginger ale sweating on the tray table in front of me, I had spent 5 years believing my mother was the entire architecture of what happened to me. One woman, one set of choices, one particular kind of blindness dressed up as love. It was a clean story. Clean stories are comforting because they give you exactly one door to walk out of and never have to look back through again. The truth, it turned out, had a great many more doors in it than that single clean one, and every last one of them had been standing slightly open the whole time, unlocked, unremarkable, waiting patiently for somebody willing to actually walk over and push on it instead of assuming it was already sealed shut for good. My mother had built the policy. My father had known about it and let it run for 18 years without once objecting out loud, telling himself that silence was a smaller sin than participation, when in fact it had simply been participation wearing a quieter coat. My sister had grown up entirely inside a story that made her the deserving one, had never once been forced to examine that story until she was 35 years old and cornered at her own family's dinner table. And I had spent all those years believing that if I simply became invisible enough, careful enough, unneeding enough, I could somehow make myself safe from a system that was never actually about my behavior at all. It was never a test I could pass. It was a structure, and structures do not care how well you perform inside them. I want to be careful here, because precision has been the only religion I have ever fully trusted, and I do not want to hand you a villain, singular, tied up neatly at the end of a video. When the truth is closer to a whole house full of people, each one making a small, survivable compromise, none of them alone quite large enough to feel like betrayal at the time it was made, until you finally stack all of those compromises up against each other and see the actual height of what they built together, one quiet decision at a time, over the better part of 2 decades. I thought about my own hands, cracked from years of dishwater and cold Montana mornings, refusing every single time to knock on a door and ask for help, fixing a broken heater myself in the dark rather than calling a landlord, because somewhere in that house, I had absorbed the lesson that needing things made you a burden. A bill somebody eventually had to settle in full, with interest. Whether you had asked for the loan in the first place or not, I understood, finally, at 31,000 feet, exactly where that lesson had come from. It had not come from nowhere. It had come from watching for 18 years. Exactly what happened to a girl who dared to need anything out loud, and deciding, quietly, at 8 years old, that I would simply never again give anyone in that house the chance to say no to me a second time. That is not a wound you close by hearing one apology at one birthday dinner, but it is, I think, the first fully honest sentence anyone in my family had spoken to me in 31 years. And an honest sentence, it turns out, is worth more than any amount of postcards signed the same 2 words, year after year, by someone who never once meant to ask what was actually happening on the other end of the drive. I thought, too, about my sister, sitting somewhere in her own house that same week, presumably still turning over what had happened at Thanksgiving, still deciding what to do with a phone number she had not yet used to call me. I did not know yet what shape her side of this would eventually take. I only knew, watching those Dakota clouds thin out into the flat gold light of early evening, that I was no longer willing to carry the entire weight of this family's arithmetic by myself, quietly, the way I had been trained to carry everything since I was 8 years old, standing on a porch with a suitcase I had not asked for. By the time the plane began its descent into Kalispell, the mountains finally visible again through the window, snow already sitting heavy on the peaks, I had made one decision I felt entirely steady about, steadier than I had felt about almost anything else in this whole strange, unfolding year, whatever came next. With my mother, with my sister, with the money already spent and unrecoverable, I was going to handle it the same way I had handled every other hard thing since I was 18. Quietly, deliberately, with the numbers written down where I could actually see them, and with nobody else's permission required first. A few days after I got back, an envelope arrived at the cafe addressed in my father's handwriting. The up and down, careful lettering of a man who had spent decades signing off on stamped parts and shift reports for a living, gone visibly shakier now at the tail of every letter than it had been even a year earlier. Not a flip phone photograph this time, and not another folded document from a title company either. A real letter, folded in thirds, 3 full pages front and back. More words than I think I had ever received from him at once in my entire life, before or since. I read it standing at the counter after closing, the ovens still ticking as they cooled behind me, the way I had once turned a scratched postcard over and over under a motel lamp 2,000 miles from anyone who loved me. Some things, I was learning, only make sense to me when I am standing perfectly still to receive them. Both hands flat on a counter, nothing else competing for my attention. He wrote that he had been ashamed to say any of it out loud while I still lived under that roof, worried that saying it would only make an already difficult childhood harder for me to carry, though he admitted, plainly and without excusing himself, that this reasoning had mostly protected him rather than me. He wrote that he had been ashamed again, differently, once I was already gone, because by then admitting the truth would have meant admitting he could have used exactly that money to help keep me closer, to visit me properly, to fly out and see the life I was building instead of only hearing about it secondhand, or to have brought me home for a single ordinary weekend instead of losing 5 whole years to a silence he had allowed to calcify slowly into permanent distance. He wrote that he did not expect the letter to fix anything between us, that he had come to understand, late in life, that some things do not actually get fixed by finally being said out loud. They only get made honest, which he had decided, after 18 years of the other option, was still worth doing on its own. The line that stopped me longest sat near the bottom of the second page, written slightly larger than the rest, as though he had pressed down harder while writing it. I spent 18 years being a good man about everything except the one thing that mattered most. I am sorry it took your sister's slip of the tongue and a lawyer's phone call to finally make me say so. I did not cry reading it, though I came close twice, once at that line, and once further down, where he mentioned, almost as an aside, tucked between 2 much heavier paragraphs, that he still had the newspaper article about the cafe framed on his own bedside table, not the copy from my parents' hallway. A second one he had quietly ordered for himself months earlier, and never once told anyone about, not even my mother. because he said he liked having something in that house that belonged only to him and to me. I did not write back right away. I let the letter sit on the shelf for 2 full days before I even touched it again. I did not forgive him in that moment either. Not fully. Not in the tidy way a letter like that might have wanted from me if it had been written by someone less honest, someone hoping the act of writing alone would be enough to close the account. What I did instead was fold the letter back along its own creases, the exact way he always folded things, and set it on the shelf above my stove, next to the cookie tin, where I keep the things I actually intend to look at again. I called him 2 nights later, on an ordinary Wednesday instead of our usual Sunday slot, because I did not want to wait 5 more days to say what I had decided to say. I told him I had read every word. I told him I was not ready to call the account settled, and that I did not think he expected me to be, and I told him, because it was true, and because he had earned at least this much honesty in return, that the letter was the first time in my entire life I had felt like he was actually in the room with me, instead of standing quietly in a doorway somewhere behind everyone else. He was quiet for a moment on his end of the line, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded steadier than I had heard it in months, disease and all, as though saying the truth out loud on paper had settled something in him that 18 years of silence never once managed to settle. "I'd like to earn the rest of it back," he said, "however long that takes. Nora, I'm not asking you to hurry it." I told him I thought that sounded fair. And that fair, at this point in our particular history, was more than either of us could have promised each other a year earlier. It was the closest either of us came, that night, to using the word forgiveness out loud. And I have found, in the time since, that some of the truest agreements between 2 people never actually need that specific word spoken between them to be entirely real. I called my father back a week after that first Wednesday check-in and laid out exactly how I wanted his care to work going forward. Calmly, the same register I had used at Thanksgiving, the one that gets you further than volume ever does. The home care invoices would keep coming directly to me, through the account I had already set up, and I would keep paying them myself for as long as he needed the help. What would change was simple. My mother would no longer be involved in any part of that arrangement. Not the scheduling, not the payments, not the conversations with the agency coordinator. If she wanted updates on his care, she could ask him, or she could ask me directly, in a phone call, like anyone else who wanted information from a business they were not actually running. He agreed without arguing, which told me something about how much had genuinely shifted in him since that birthday dinner. Back when a single unfinished sentence could sit in him for 18 years, without ever quite making it out into the open air. "That's fair," he said. "More than fair." I did not ask him to say anything else about it, and he did not offer to. And the silence between us this time felt entirely different from every other silence that man had ever handed me across a kitchen table. I did not ask for the summer fund money back either, not from him, not from my mother, not from anyone else who might technically owe me some portion of it on paper. I want to be precise about why, because I know it might sound, from the outside, like I was simply letting something go too easily. It was not that. Money spent 18 years ago, quietly, without my knowledge, folded invisibly into somebody else's family vacations, is not a debt with a clean number attached to it anymore. Chasing it would have meant years of lawyers and receipts and arguments over a sum neither side could even agree existed in exactly the same form. It was never really about the dollars, and I do not think it ever had been, not once, in any part of this entire story. It was about finally knowing, precisely and completely, what had actually happened to me across all those summers. And now, at last, I did. I sent my sister a single text message that same week, the only message I had sent her since the night we drove home from Thanksgiving in near total silence. I know about the fund. I know about the deed. I am not coming for either one. I just needed you to know that I know. I did not add anything softer to cushion it, and I did not add anything harder either. I wanted the message to read exactly the way it was meant, flat and factual. A receipt rather than an accusation. The kind of sentence my mother might have recognized from her own playbook if she had ever seen it. Minus the church smile attached to the end of it. I watched the 3 dots appear on my screen almost immediately after I sent it. Disappear, appear again, disappear a second time. No reply came that night. I did not send a follow-up message, and I did not call to soften what I had already said in writing. Some sentences, I had learned by then, work best left standing exactly as they were first delivered, without anyone rushing in afterward to explain or apologize for their own honesty. I thought, sending it. About the version of myself who used to hide $7,000 in tip money behind a row of winter coats, rather than let anyone in that house know she had a plan of her own. That version of me would never have sent a message like this one. She would have absorbed the knowledge quietly, filed it away in the same drawer that held a phone call she was not supposed to have overheard, and said nothing at all, because saying nothing had always felt safer than being the one who finally stirred the pot. I was not that version of myself anymore, and sending that text was, in its own small way, proof of exactly how far the distance between those 2 versions of me had actually grown. This is the part of the story I think the people listening to this will understand best, better than almost anyone else might. Real justice, the kind that actually lets you sleep at night afterward, rarely looks like a screaming match at a dinner table or a lawsuit dragged out over years in a courtroom. It looks like paperwork, quietly gathered over months. It looks like a bank statement, a scratched-out sentence on the back of a postcard, an old man's joke about a house nobody quite remembered to explain properly to the one daughter it actually concerned. It looks like simply refusing, calmly and permanently, to let anyone in your family manage the story about you ever again, without your own name actually being in the room to correct it in real time. I did not need my mother to apologize for me to move forward with any of this. I want to say that plainly, because I know some of you listening are waiting for a scene where she finally breaks down completely and says all the right words. That scene, as far as I can tell you honestly, has not happened yet, and I have stopped organizing my own piece around whether it ever will. My sister called 2 days after that text message. Not texted back, called, which told me something before she had even said a single word into the phone. Her voice, when I answered, did not have the defensive edge it had carried at Thanksgiving. It sounded smaller, more tired, closer to the voice she had used the night she first called me after our parents' visit to the cafe, the one that had asked whether it was true I had loved being sent away. I told myself Mom handled it fair, she said, without any preamble at all. I didn't look too hard at any of it, because looking too hard would have meant giving something back. And I liked what I had. I liked being the one who didn't have to ask questions. A pause. I'm not proud of that. I've had a lot of time to sit with it since Thanksgiving. I did not rush to reassure her that it was fine, because it was not entirely fine, and I did not think either of us needed me to pretend otherwise just to make the phone call more comfortable. I let her sentence hang there for as long as it wanted to hang. The same patience I had learned to extend to silence at that dinner table months earlier. She offered, next, to have her name taken off the deed entirely, to sign whatever it took to undo the arrangement from 11 years ago. I told her I did not want it. Not out of generosity exactly, though I suppose some of that was in there too. Mostly because taking half a house I never asked for would have felt like accepting a consolation prize for a childhood I was not actually trying to get compensated for. What I wanted was simpler and, in its own way, harder to give her. I wanted her to actually know what she had been part of, instead of comfortably not knowing. I don't need the house. Cass, I told her. I needed you to stop pretending you didn't understand the shape of it. She was quiet again, and when she spoke next, her voice had thinned out even further. I keep thinking about the postcards, she said. I used to see them on the hutch and think it was sweet, that Mom kept them out like that. I never once thought to ask why there were 2 sets. I want to be fair to her here too, the same way I promised at the start of all this to be fair to everyone in this story. Exactly fair and not 1 ounce more. She did not have to make that call. She could have let the silence between us settle into something permanent, the way my mother seemed content to let hers settle, and nobody watching from the outside would have blamed her for choosing the easier road. She chose the harder one instead. And I think that choice, small as it might sound, described out loud, actually mattered. We did not resolve everything on that call. There was no tearful reconciliation, no promise that every future holiday would suddenly look different. What we had instead was smaller and, I think, more honest than that would have been. An agreement, unspoken but real, to start measuring each other from this point forward instead of from the old ledger neither of us had actually written ourselves. Before we hung up, she asked, quietly, whether I would be willing to meet her daughter sometime in person, away from any family occasion at all. Just the 2 of us and a 4-year-old who had no idea yet what any of this had cost either one of her aunts. I told her yes, I meant it. That night, sitting at my own kitchen counter with the cookie tin, the letter, and the folded valuation sheet all within arm's reach of each other for the first time. 3 separate pieces of the same 18 years finally gathered under one roof instead of scattered across 3 different states. I decided something I had been circling for weeks without quite landing on it. This year, I was not waiting for an invitation to anyone else's table. I was building my own in the one place that had never once asked me to disappear. I thought about calling Aunt Roberta right then, to tell her about the conversation with Cass, and decided instead to let it wait until our regular Sunday call, the way ordinary news waits its turn in an ordinary week. Some phone calls, I had learned, deserved to be treated like any other update about an ordinary life, not rushed out the moment they happened simply because they used to be rare. That, more than almost anything else, felt like the actual measure of how far my family had come since a green suitcase first appeared on my bed 23 years earlier. Not that everything had healed, only that some of it, finally, had stopped feeling like an emergency every time it moved. I did not hear from my mother that week, or the week after. I did not expect to. And I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I no longer organized my days around waiting for that particular phone to ring the way I once had. Back when a single unanswered question could occupy an entire summer of a girl's attention, some doors, I was learning, do not slam shut dramatically in this life. They simply settle closed, quietly, at their own pace, while you go on building something else entirely in a different room. So here's the full accounting. 12 months later, because I made you a promise of honesty back at the start of all this, not some neatly tied bow wrapped around a situation that remains, frankly, and probably always will remain, unfinished business. Margot and I signed the papers on the cafe in March. The number came up short by exactly the amount I expected it to come up short. And she waved her hand at the difference and redrew the note herself. Right there, at her own kitchen table, 28,000 down instead of 46. The rest folded into the monthly payments, 5 more years added onto the term instead of 4. It will cost me more in total by the time it is finally paid off. I signed it anyway, smiling the entire time, because a dream carrying a little extra weight, it turns out, still counts fully as a dream. There is a new line of paint on the front door glass now, small, under Margot's own name, because I specifically asked for small N. Bishop, proprietor. My father sends photographs almost every week now, steadier ones, better composed, though never quite as good as the ones Patrice takes for him. We talk on Sundays, sometimes for 15 minutes, sometimes for a full hour if there is actually something worth saying that week. He mentioned a few months ago that he was thinking about flying out to see the cafe in person for the first time, and I told him I would teach him to roll a proper pie crust if he did. The same way Aunt Roberta once taught me, hands over hands, cold fingers and a warm heart. My mother and I have not spoken since that birthday dinner. A card arrived at the cafe in December. Tasteful, no letter tucked inside it, signed in her round, familiar handwriting. Mom. Not sorry. Not love. Just the one title she is apparently not ready to lose entirely. Even now, I do not know what happens next between us, if anything does. Some doors in this life do not slam. They simply settle closed, quietly, at their own pace, and I have stopped trying to force mine back open before it is ready. My sister and I talk more than either of us probably expected we would a year ago. Careful, ordinary conversations mostly, the kind two adults have when they are still learning each other from scratch as the people they actually are now. Instead of the roles a childhood assigned them, she flew out in July with her husband and their daughter, and I finally met my niece in person for the first time, 4 years into her life. She spent most of the visit orbiting my pastry case like a small, determined moon, and by the end of the second day she had decided, entirely on her own authority, that I was to be called Aunt Pie from now on, a title I have legally and enthusiastically accepted. She asked me, at one point during that visit, standing in my kitchen while her daughter napped in the back office on a blanket I keep specifically for that purpose now, whether I thought our mother would ever actually change. I told her I honestly did not know, and that I had stopped needing the answer to that particular question in order to keep moving forward with my own life. She nodded slowly, like that was not the answer she had been hoping for, but was, perhaps, the one she had already privately arrived at herself. On the visit's final morning, my sister lingered a good while at the shelf mounted above my stove, where the cookie tin now stays open permanently, and she read the backs of all 8 postcards, one at a time, our mother's handwriting on one side, my own on the other. She did not say much when she finished. She squared the cards back into a neat stack, set them down carefully, and said, "I'm sorry I never turned them over myself. That was the whole apology I ever got out of that entire chapter of this family. It was also, somehow, the only one that ever actually needed to matter." I still have not spoken to Cass about the deed since that phone call. I check every so often in a way I am not entirely proud of, that her name has not moved anywhere it should not, and it never has. She kept her word about that much, at least, and I have come to believe, slowly, that keeping your word about the small things is sometimes the only proof anyone gets that the larger apology was real. Which brings us to this year's Thanksgiving, the first one I have ever hosted myself. We pushed every table in the cafe into one long line, running from the kitchen doorway all the way to the front window, and we fed whoever in this town had nowhere better to be that day. Staff, regulars, a new line cook whose family is still back in Guatemala this year, a widower named Gus who tips exclusively in firewood and homemade jam, 26 chairs, no swans folded into the napkins, no announcements read aloud over anyone's dinner. Margot said grace in 2 languages, the way she always does, hands folded, unhurried. Aunt Roberta flew out for it, the first plane she had boarded in nearly a decade, and I sat her at the very head of the table, because every kingdom, in my opinion, should get to watch its actual queen finally eat a meal in peace. Before the pie came out, I handed her a postcard. The lake outside Whitefish on the front, that same impossible painted-looking blue. On the back, in my own handwriting, the old familiar 2 words and their exclamation point. Miss you already. She read it, laughed, then went quiet, staring past the whole steaming length of that table toward the window and the actual lake glittering beyond it. And for the very first time in my life, the one person a card like that had always been intended for was sitting right there in the room beside me. These days, the green suitcase rests on top of my pantry hutch. Holiday tablecloths live inside it now, folded flat, waiting their turn twice each year. I lift it down, shake the linens loose, and lay out the longest table this town has ever seen, using the very luggage that was once meant to teach a little girl how to vanish quietly, without a sound of protest. As for what I actually learned, it fits into 1 sentence, and I have earned the right to say it plainly by now. Family is not the people who share your blood or your last name. It is the people who never make you send a postcard in the first place, because they never once let you become the one who is missing from the table. That's my story, in full, 8 summers, 1 green suitcase, and a table finally carrying my own name on its door. If any of this landed close to home, some summer where you were the strong one, the steady one, or whatever label your own family reached for, leave it in the comments below. I read all of them, every single one. Pass this along to somebody who could use a longer table of their own this year. Comment, subscribe, and I'll meet you again in the next story. He wrote that he did not expect the letter to fix anything between us, that he had come to understand, late in life, that some things do not actually get fixed by finally being said out loud. They only get made honest, which he had decided, after 18 years of the other option, was still worth doing on its own. The line that stopped me longest sat near the bottom of the 2nd page, written slightly larger than the rest, as though he had pressed down harder while writing it. I spent 18 years being a good man about everything except the one thing that mattered most. I am sorry it took your sister's slip of the tongue and a lawyer's phone call to finally make me say so. I did not cry reading it, though I came close twice, once at that line, and once further down, where he mentioned, almost as an aside, tucked between 2 much heavier paragraphs, that he still had the newspaper article about the cafe framed on his own bedside table, not the copy from my parents' hallway. A second one he had quietly ordered for himself months earlier and never once told anyone about, not even my mother. Because he said he liked having something in that house that belonged only to him and to me, I did not write back right away. I let the letter sit on the shelf for 2 full days before I even touched it again. I did not forgive him in that moment either. Not fully. Not in the tidy way a letter like that might have wanted from me if it had been written by someone less honest. Someone hoping the act of writing alone would be enough to close the account. What I did instead was fold the letter back along its own creases, the exact way he always folded things, and set it on the shelf above my stove, next to the cookie tin, where I keep the things I actually intend to look at again. I called him 2 nights later, on an ordinary Wednesday instead of our usual Sunday slot, because I did not want to wait 5 more days to say what I had decided to say. I told him I had read every word. I told him I was not ready to call the account settled, and that I did not think he expected me to be, and I told him because it was true and because he had earned at least this much honesty in return. That the letter was the first time in my entire life I had felt like he was actually in the room with me instead of standing quietly in a doorway somewhere behind everyone else. He was quiet for a moment on his end of the line, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded steadier than I had heard it in months. Disease and all, as though saying the truth out loud on paper had settled something in him that 18 years of silence never once managed to settle. "I'd like to earn the rest of it back," he said, "however long that takes." "Nora, I'm not asking you to hurry it." I told him I thought that sounded fair, and that fair, at this point in our particular history, was more than either of us could have promised each other a year earlier. It was the closest either of us came. That night, to using the word forgiveness out loud. And I have found in the time since that some of the truest agreements between two people never actually need that specific word spoken between them to be entirely real. I called my father back a week after that first Wednesday check-in and laid out exactly how I wanted his care to work going forward. Calmly, the same register I had used at Thanksgiving, the one that gets you further than volume ever does. The home care invoices would keep coming directly to me through the account I had already set up, and I would keep paying them myself for as long as he needed the help. What would change was simple. My mother would no longer be involved in any part of that arrangement, not the scheduling, not the payments, not the conversations with the agency coordinator. If she wanted updates on his care, she could ask him, or she could ask me directly, in a phone call. Like anyone else who wanted information from a business they were not actually running. He agreed without arguing, which told me something about how much had genuinely shifted in him since that birthday dinner. Back when a single unfinished sentence could sit in him for 18 years without ever quite making it out into the open air. "That's fair," he said. "More than fair." I did not ask him to say anything else about it, and he did not offer to. And the silence between us this time felt entirely different from every other silence that man had ever handed me across a kitchen table. I did not ask for the summer fund money back either. Not from him, not from my mother, not from anyone else who might technically owe me some portion of it on paper. I want to be precise about why, because I know it might sound, from the outside, like I was simply letting something go too easily. It was not that. Money spent 18 years ago, quietly, without my knowledge, folded invisibly into somebody else's family vacations, is not a debt with a clean number attached to it anymore. Chasing it would have meant years of lawyers and receipts and arguments over a sum neither side could even agree existed in exactly the same form. It was never really about the dollars, and I do not think it ever had been, not once, in any part of this entire story. It was about finally knowing, precisely and completely, what had actually happened to me across all those summers. And now, at last, I did. I sent my sister a single text message that same week, the only message I had sent her since the night we drove home from Thanksgiving in near total silence. "I know about the fund. I know about the deed. I am not coming for either one. I just needed you to know that I know." I did not add anything softer to cushion it, and I did not add anything harder either. I wanted the message to read exactly the way it was meant, flat and factual. A receipt rather than an accusation. The kind of sentence my mother might have recognized from her own playbook if she had ever seen it, minus the church smile attached to the end of it. I watched the 3 dots appear on my screen almost immediately after I sent it. Disappear, appear again. disappear a second time. No reply came that night. I did not send a follow-up message, and I did not call to soften what I had already said in writing. Some sentences, I had learned by then, work best left standing exactly as they were first delivered, without anyone rushing in afterward to explain or apologize for their own honesty. I thought, sending it about the version of myself who used to hide $7,000 in tip money behind a row of winter coats rather than let anyone in that house know she had a plan of her own. That version of me would never have sent a message like this one. She would have absorbed the knowledge quietly, filed it away in the same drawer that held a phone call she was not supposed to have overheard, and said nothing at all, because saying nothing had always felt safer than being the one who finally stirred the pot. I was not that version of myself anymore, and sending that text was, in its own small way, proof of exactly how far the distance between those two versions of me had actually grown. This is the part of the story I think the people listening to this will understand best, better than almost anyone else might. Real justice, the kind that actually lets you sleep at night afterward, rarely looks like a screaming match at a dinner table or a lawsuit dragged out over years in a courtroom. It looks like paperwork, quietly gathered over months. It looks like a bank statement, a scratched-out sentence on the back of a postcard, an old man's joke about a house nobody quite remembered to explain properly to the one daughter it actually concerned. It looks like simply refusing, calmly and permanently, to let anyone in your family manage the story about you ever again without your own name actually being in the room to correct it in real time. I did not need my mother to apologize for me to move forward with any of this. I want to say that plainly, because I know some of you listening are waiting for a scene where she finally breaks down completely and says all the right words. That scene, as far as I can tell you honestly, has not happened yet, and I have stopped organizing my own piece around whether it ever will. My sister called 2 days after that text message, not texted back, called, which told me something before she had even said a single word into the phone. Her voice, when I answered, did not have the defensive edge it had carried at Thanksgiving. It sounded smaller, more tired, closer to the voice she had used the night she first called me after our parents' visit to the cafe. The one that had asked whether it was true I had loved being sent away. I told myself Mom handled it fair, she said without any preamble at all. I didn't look too hard at any of it, because looking too hard would have meant giving something back, and I liked what I had. I liked being the one who didn't have to ask questions. A pause. I'm not proud of that. I've had a lot of time to sit with it since Thanksgiving. I did not rush to reassure her that it was fine, because it was not entirely fine, and I did not think either of us needed me to pretend otherwise just to make the phone call more comfortable. I let her sentence hang there for as long as it wanted to hang. The same patience I had learned to extend to silence at that dinner table months earlier. She offered next to have her name taken off the deed entirely, to sign whatever it took to undo the arrangement from 11 years ago. I told her I did not want it, not out of generosity exactly, though I suppose some of that was in there too. Mostly because taking half a house I never asked for would have felt like accepting a consolation prize for a childhood I was not actually trying to get compensated for. What I wanted was simpler and, in its own way, harder to give her. I wanted her to actually know what she had been part of, instead of comfortably not knowing. I don't need the house, Cass, I told her. I needed you to stop pretending you didn't understand the shape of it. She was quiet again, and when she spoke next, her voice had thinned out even further. I keep thinking about the postcards, she said. I used to see them on the hutch and think it was sweet. that Mom kept them out like that. I never once thought to ask why there were two sets. I want to be fair to her here too, the same way I promised at the start of all this to be fair to everyone in this story. Exactly fair, and not 1 ounce more. She did not have to make that call. She could have let the silence between us settle into something permanent, the way my mother seemed content to let hers settle, and nobody watching from the outside would have blamed her for choosing the easier road. She chose the harder one instead, and I think that choice, small as it might sound described out loud, actually mattered. We did not resolve everything on that call. There was no tearful reconciliation, no promise that every future holiday would suddenly look different. What we had instead was smaller and, I think, more honest than that would have been. An agreement, unspoken but real, to start measuring each other from this point forward instead of from the old ledger neither of us had actually written ourselves. Before we hung up, she asked, quietly, whether I would be willing to meet her daughter sometime in person, away from any family occasion at all. Just the two of us and a 4-year-old who had no idea yet what any of this had cost either one of her aunts. I told her yes. I meant it. That night, sitting at my own kitchen counter with the cookie tin, the letter, and the folded valuation sheet all within arm's reach of each other for the first time, 3 separate pieces of the same 18 years finally gathered under one roof instead of scattered across 3 different states. I decided something I had been circling for weeks without quite landing on it. This year, I was not waiting for an invitation to anyone else's table. I was building my own, in the one place that had never once asked me to disappear. I thought about calling Aunt Roberta right then to tell her about the conversation with Cass, and decided instead to let it wait until our regular Sunday call, the way ordinary news waits its turn in an ordinary week. Some phone calls, I had learned, deserved to be treated like any other update about an ordinary life, not rushed out the moment they happen simply because they used to be rare. That, more than almost anything else, felt like the actual measure of how far my family had come since a green suitcase first appeared on my bed 23 years earlier. Not that everything had healed, only that some of it, finally, had stopped feeling like an emergency every time it moved. I did not hear from my mother that week, or the week after. I did not expect to, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I no longer organized my days around waiting for that particular phone to ring the way I once had. Back when a single unanswered question could occupy an entire summer of a girl's attention. Some doors. I was learning. Do not slam shut dramatically in this life. They simply settle closed, quietly, at their own pace, while you go on building something else entirely in a different room. So here's the full accounting, 12 months later. Because I made you a promise of honesty back at the start of all this, not some neatly tied bow wrapped around a situation that remains, frankly, and probably always will remain, unfinished business. Margot and I signed the papers on the cafe in March. The number came up short by exactly the amount I expected it to come up short, and she waved her hand at the difference and redrew the note herself, right there at her own kitchen table, 28,000 down instead of 46. The rest folded into the monthly payments. 5 more years added onto the term instead of 4. It will cost me more in total by the time it is finally paid off. I signed it anyway, smiling the entire time, because a dream carrying a little extra weight, it turns out, still counts fully as a dream. There is a new line of paint on the front door glass now. Small. Under Margot's own name, because I specifically asked for small N. Bishop, proprietor. My father sends photographs almost every week now, steadier ones, better composed, though never quite as good as the ones Patrice takes for him. We talk on Sundays, sometimes for 15 minutes, sometimes for a full hour if there is actually something worth saying that week. He mentioned a few months ago that he was thinking about flying out to see the cafe in person for the first time, and I told him I would teach him to roll a proper pie crust if he did, the same way Aunt Roberta once taught me, hands over hands, cold fingers, and a warm heart. My mother and I have not spoken since that birthday dinner. A card arrived at the cafe in December, tasteful, no letter tucked inside it, signed in her round, familiar handwriting. Mom, not sorry, not love, just the one title she is apparently not ready to lose entirely. Even now. I do not know what happens next between us, if anything does. Some doors in this life do not slam. They simply settle closed, quietly, at their own pace, and I have stopped trying to force mine back open before it is ready. My sister and I talk more than either of us probably expected we would a year ago. Careful, ordinary conversations mostly, the kind two adults have when they are still learning each other from scratch as the people they actually are now, instead of the roles a childhood assigned them. She flew out in July with her husband and their daughter, and I finally met my niece in person for the first time, 4 years into her life. She spent most of the visit orbiting my pastry case, like a small, determined moon, and by the end of the second day she had decided entirely on her own authority that I was to be called Aunt Pie from now on, a title I have legally and enthusiastically accepted. She asked me, at one point during that visit, standing in my kitchen while her daughter napped in the back office on a blanket, I keep specifically for that purpose now, whether I thought our mother would ever actually change. I told her I honestly did not know, and that I had stopped needing the answer to that particular question in order to keep moving forward with my own life. She nodded slowly, like that was not the answer she had been hoping for, but was, perhaps, the one she had already privately arrived at herself. On the visit's final morning, my sister lingered a good while at the shelf mounted above my stove, where the cookie tin now stays open permanently, and she read the backs of all 8 postcards, one at a time, our mother's handwriting on one side, my own on the other. She did not say much when she finished. She squared the cards back into a neat stack, set them down carefully, and said, "I'm sorry I never turned them over myself. That was the whole apology I ever got out of that entire chapter of this family. It was also, somehow, the only one that ever actually needed to matter." I still have not spoken to Cass about the deed since that phone call. I check, every so often, in a way I am not entirely proud of, that her name has not moved anywhere it should not, and it never has. She kept her word about that much, at least, and I have come to believe slowly that keeping your word about the small things is sometimes the only proof anyone gets that the larger apology was real. Which brings us to this year's Thanksgiving, the first one I have ever hosted myself. We pushed every table in the cafe into one long line, running from the kitchen doorway all the way to the front window, and we fed whoever in this town had nowhere better to be that day. Staff, regulars, a new line cook whose family is still back in Guatemala this year, a widower named Gus who tips exclusively in firewood and homemade jam, 26 chairs, no swans folded into the napkins, no announcements read aloud over anyone's dinner. Margot said grace in 2 languages, the way she always does, hands folded, unhurried. Aunt Roberta flew out for it, the first plane she had boarded in nearly a decade, and I sat her at the very head of the table, because every kingdom, in my opinion, should get to watch its actual queen finally eat a meal in peace. Before the pie came out, I handed her a postcard. The lake outside, whitefish on the front, that same impossible painted-looking blue. On the back, in my own handwriting, the old familiar 2 words and their exclamation point. "Miss you already." She read it, laughed, then went quiet, staring past the whole steaming length of that table toward the window and the actual lake glittering beyond it. And for the very first time in my life, the one person a card like that had always been intended for was sitting right there in the room beside me. These days, the green suitcase rests on top of my pantry hutch. Holiday tablecloths live inside it now, folded flat, waiting their turn twice each year. I lift it down, shake the linens loose, and lay out the longest table this town has ever seen, using the very luggage that was once meant to teach a little girl how to vanish quietly, without a sound of protest. As for what I actually learned, it fits into one sentence, and I have earned the right to say it plainly by now. Family is not the people who share your blood or your last name. It is the people who never make you send a postcard in the first place, because they never once let you become the one who is missing from the table. That's my story, in full. 8 summers, 1 green suitcase, and a table finally carrying my own name on its door. If any of this landed close to home, some summer where you were the strong one, the steady one, or whatever label your own family reached for, leave it in the comments below. I read all of them, every single one. Pass this along to somebody who could use a longer table of their own this year. Comment, subscribe, and I'll meet you again in the next